All right. I'm now joined by Russ Sbriglia, who is a literature professor. I just found out he's working on a book about Hegel and vertigo, and also is the person who I first met because Michael Brooks and I had dinner with him, when Michael was booking Žižek. So I always kind of think of him as Slavoj Zizek's American consigliere, but that's Russ.
That's if I can be remembered, that's good enough for me. So
fair enough. And Matt McManus, who is a political science professor and is the author of many things in lots of stuff on postmodern conservatism, and he is one of the co-authors of Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson, along with me, Marion Trejo, and Conrad Hamilton. And that one also has a introduction by Žižek, which I was actually just looking at earlier today again, for the first time in a long time since...
As you said, the most famous thing he'll have ever written, right?
Yeah. Primarily, Žižek is known as the author of the introduction to Myth and Mayhem.
Myth and Mayhem.
He's also done some other stuff.
I mean, he agrees with that, so
Yeah, there you go.
So we now, even though we said this in the description on the video, and I said this everywhere I posted the video, I know that there will still be people who are confused about this. So just for the record, because it is currently 2 a.m. in Slovenia, and that's not reasonable. He'll stay up late to do interviews, but not that late. We interviewed him a few hours ago when it was when it was only 9:30 in Slovenia, and so we have that pre-recorded. So that's like 40 minutes pre-recorded, and then when that's over, we'll be back live, and we will watch and comment on the first half of the Žižek-Peterson debate, which is since it's a very long debate, and we're starting with this 40-minute interview with Žižek. We're just kind of recapping it. That's we are splitting this up into 2 Sundays. That would be too much, but. I will say also before we,
we should just release a big giant cut of this when it's done and see who watches it. Separate the boys from the men.
Yeah.
4-hour takedown.
True test of endurance.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of funny. My wife Jennifer is not nearly as plugged into. Online left stuff as I am, because whatever's wrong with me is wrong with her. But she did. So I was showing her some classic clips that she hadn't seen this afternoon of Žižek saying and so on a bunch of times. Žižek walking down the street eating 2 hot dogs in different hands. Get a little little bit of a sense of the man beyond his philosophical contributions. And some of the clip that I released earlier, but no, it is hard to overstate how much I love this guy. I've been appreciating his work for a long time. We were just talking before we went live about the Pervert's Guide to Ideology and the Pervert's Guide to Cinema, which are both movies I saw. Saw Pervert's Guide to Ideology when it first came out. I definitely watched that one in a theater. And Pervert's Guide to Cinema I watched as soon as I could finally track down a DVD, which took a long time.
I don't know if they started it yet or if it's still on. I'll have to ask them, but they're supposed to do a third one. It was going to be Pervert's Guide to Opera. And
that'd be cool.
Sophie Fiennes, who directs this, was like, no one's going to watch that. So I think they're going to
watch it.
I know. Well, I think they settled on, maybe it was the studio. I think they're settling on Pervert's Guide to the 21st Century, but I have no idea if that even started filming yet, or if they're going to still do it. But I think they're going to do it.
Man, have you seen
now I kind of want to see the opera one.
Have you seen Examine Life, Ben? This is my favorite one with Žižek in it, actually.
I actually never saw the Examine Life. No.
Okay, so it's funny. So like Cornel West is awesome in it, right? He's sitting there and he goes all kinds of rap commentary along with like references to Hegel and stuff. But like some of the interviews are super academically. Like Michael Hart is in Central Park just rowing a boat. Martha Nussbaum is walking along like a beach, ruminating on what's life. And then there's just Žižek who goes to a dump and is like ruffling through the trash, and he picks it up and he's like, "You call this porn, American pods?" and like throws it away.
Yeah, he's in a garbage dump in London somewhere. Yeah,
that's awesome.
It was,
yeah. Well, I mean, I've been I've been a big fan of the movie They Live for a very very long time. So that opening scene in Pervert's Guide to Ideology, where he's inserted into They Live to talk about eating from the trash can of ideology, like I thought that had me from the first minute. I was like, okay, this is for me.
Yeah.
All right.
I think I first heard of him. It would have been back in 2008. The guy who ended up becoming my undergraduate supervisor, who oddly enough looks a little like Žižek. He's a tall white dude with a big beard. Like Steely Dan, and like to smoke a lot of weed. That was Trevor's thing. But he was like, you got to look at this guy. He's awesome. You know what I mean? Like he's got all these kind of weird shit jokes and cinema things. And so I think the first book of his I read was actually The Sublime Object of Ideology.
Oh, wow. That is definitely jumping in on the deep end of the pool.
Yeah.
Well, they had like the little verso edition that I think most people get in the bookstore. So I just went and picked it up. And I'm not going to lie, Russ, like that was my first exposure to Lacanian theory. And I was like, I have no idea what the fuck these graphs happen to mean. You know what I mean? There was like the weird symbols like R equals P down to the phallus. And I was just
what's funny is that like really quickly, like people that is his first book in English, but he was 40 years old when it was published, and he'd been a political dissident in the former Yugoslavia. And he had all of these writings already in, a lot in Slovene, but also in French, because basically Sublime Object of Ideology is a sort of reworked version of the dissertation that he wrote for his PhD in psychoanalysis.
Really?
And so a lot of that was already. So the reason why, if you don't have a background, the Lacanian graph of desire, it's very. But also just the style of that, despite the, if you're a neophyte, the sort of impenetrability of some of the Lacan stuff. I think he makes much of it extremely accessible. I don't think anyone can make Lacan, half as accessible as Slavoj does. But that there's a reason why that book is it's his first book, and it's still his most memorable book, because he'd been working on that material for probably 10 years.
I know. Yeah. I read it. I came away with it from it with the conclusion that I sexually desire everything except for sex, which is an entirely different field. That was the number one thing I took when I was in my 20s. So.
No comment. No, that's fair. I actually, so I remember for some reason, my like this is a weird thing I'm going to say on stream, but for some reason, my parents, when I was growing up, had there was a VHS they had in the house that was like just like I think they like recorded from PBS or something of a performance of Wagner's Ring Cycle on at the Met, which I very quickly discovered. My little brother is 7 years younger than me. That whenever I was supposed to like take care of my little brother for the night, I could stick this on the VCR and he would be out asleep like in 5 minutes, and I'd have the rest of the night to myself. So, watch the beginning of this at least many times, and then of course eventually, he got old enough that he'd like start asking questions about the plot and stuff. It didn't work anymore, but so I can imagine that pretty vividly, and I kind of want to see Žižek inserted into it, a la the Sublime, a la the Pervert's Guide movies.
He's got a book on Wagner, and another one on opera. So I'll send you them. I'll send you the PDFs.
Nice, yeah, please do. Okay, so we're gonna watch this because he ended up being very generous with his time. So this is longer than we thought it was, and we want to get to at least a decent chunk of the debate tonight, if possible. I should say in advance that obviously, I've just been going on and on about how big a fan I am of Slavoj Zizek. But also, at this point, I've interviewed the guy twice, and conversations go where they're going to go. That's the nature of the beast. So there are parts of this that are about the Peterson debate. That's like a thread that runs through it, but there are parts of this that are about a lot of other things too. So if you're kind of watching this thinking, wait a second, but what about just relax, settle into it. You just kind of have to experience it as what it is. And when it's done, we'll actually start watching the first part of the debate and talking about that. So, if you're worried at some point when you're watching it, you're not going to get enough Jordan Peterson debunking tonight. Please don't worry about it. You will.
What I only don't quite get, why do you put so much access to this? We have to begin with the personal change. This is also the second or which one, I don't remember, forgive me, of your slogans in your book. First set your house in order, then. But I have an extremely common sense, naive question here. But what if in trying to set your house in order, you discover that your house is in disorder precisely because the way the society is messed up, which doesn't mean, okay, let's forget about my house. But you can do both at the same time, and I would even say, I will give you now the ultimate example, yourself. Isn't it that you are so socially active? Because you realize that it's not enough to tell to your patients, set your house in order. Much of the reason of why they are in disorder, their house, is that there is some crisis in our society and so on and so on. So my reproach to you, benevolent, would have been, the joke, tea or coffee, yes, please. Like individual or social, yes, please, because this is obvious in extreme situation. Like, I hope we agree to say to somebody in North Korea, set your house in order. No, but I think in some deeper sense, it goes also for our societies. I'm just repeating what you are telling. You see some kind of a social crisis, and I don't see clearly why insist so much on this choice. Because, sorry, just to finish, I will give you an example that I think perfectly does it. How do we usually deal with ecology? By this false personalization. They tell you, what did you do? Did you put all the Coke cans on the side? Did you recycle all paper and so? Yes, we should do this. But, you know, like, in a way, this is also a very easy way to discharge yourself. Like, you say, okay, I do the recycling, so up, you know, I did my duty, let's go on. So I would just say, why the choice there?
All right. I am now joined by Russ Sbriglia and Matt McManus, as well as Slavoj Zizek, who is, of course, best known for having written the introduction to this book, Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson. Has also written
It's the number one thing on his Wikipedia page.
Yeah. But he also debated Jordan Peterson in 2019 in Toronto, back when we could all go outside. And we just watched a little preview of that. Later on, we're pre-recording this because the live stream is not going to be until 8, which is 2 in the morning in Slovenia. But we just played a little preview of that debate. And I think first of all, thank you for coming on, and I want and giving us this chance to kind of look back on that a little bit and some of the issues that you raised there. And one thing that so in the clip we saw, right, you were really giving your like that was one of the places where you were really going after the sort of Peterson worldview, the focus on getting individual lives together, and talking about the limits of that. But also, it does really strike me that in the debate, I think something that some people who maybe didn't understand quite what you're going for were surprised by is that it was relatively friendly for the most part. And I think that it seemed to me, right, you can tell me whether this is right or not, it seemed to me that part of what you're doing in the debate was sort of showing the confused young guys who follow Jordan Peterson that there is a version of the left that's not sort of bogged down in PC moralism, and that much might be much more appealing to them.
Yeah, I answer. Okay. No, you got it. You are totally right. I didn't want to focus on attacking Peterson, whom I even, as far as I know it, as a person, consider absolutely not simply a bad guy. Let me tell you a secret. Okay, a secret which maybe I told publicly just 10, 20 times. But do you remember, what is it now? Already some 3-4 years, even more ago, that debate on Canadian TV. Peterson versus a couple of LGBT politically correct guys. I must say, together with, I heard even Chomsky and some others. I was there on Peterson's side. You know what did strike me? Those guys who were protecting this, each person has to have himself or herself or themselves named, called the way they want, and so on. And then the most shocking moment for him was when one of the guys said, but don't you know, even in nature, sexes don't exist. And in this very patronizing way, if you don't know it, I can give you some books. But I mean, I don't see anything else in that than this most common place that, of course, sexes are always blurred and so on and so on. But I find this an extremely dangerous line of thought, because I'm hearing from my liberal, not true left friends, the same argument against class struggle, for example. There is no class struggle, there are just multiple groups, conflicts, and so on and so on. And I think this is a dialectic which is well developed in Marxism, that the paradox is that you have a basic antagonism, but this antagonism necessarily appears empirically as multiplicity. The basic point of Marx is that class struggle doesn't mean there are, either now or in some utopian, which will never come, revolutionary moment, there will be pure conflict, just two classes. No, whole class struggle is the struggle, position war, as Gramsci would have put it, for who will get all those who are in out class struggle, not with a clear role in it. Class struggle is necessarily a multiplicity, but it's still a basic antagonism. So, and also that line of attack, treating Peterson as an idiot who didn't read books, where they explain to you everything, that there are not only two sexes. The first thing, as my colleague Alenka Zupancic developed nicely in her book, what I question is the very, and this is a general tendency, the replacement of the term sex with gender. Gender is a category of identity. It's not neutral, this operation. So again, although at the level of actual measures, I totally support LGBT, and I'm saying this absolutely sincerely, but I think I totally support them, but not because, now comes the central point, not because I think that, and that's the image of some LGBT ideologies, that basically we have some, before the fall, happy, neutral sexuality, just multiple forms and so on and so on. And then the bad patriarchy comes imposing binary notions, but we have to get rid of this patriarchal logic, and then this happy multiplicity will re-emerge. No, I think, again, and Peterson is closer to this than some LGBT people. Didn't you notice how, that was also one of my reasons why I appeared there, how, and I cannot get rid, and Russell, you also know this, that many of these LGBT politically correct theorists, I don't confuse them, act as if, although it's so fashionable today to say, oh, Freud is outdated, blah, blah, Victorian era bullshit, but they act as if, as if Freud didn't exist, as if the unconscious doesn't exist. For example, the whole theory of agreement, you know, we have to sign agreement before making love and so on and so on. The presupposition is pure liberal one. Forget unconscious, forget your personal mess. Basically, looking deep into ourselves, we are free persons who know what we want. All trouble comes from external power relations. But what if the lesson of the Freud is that sex is immanently messed, confused, perverted? You cannot separate sex from power. And if you tell me, but then this means sex is in itself corrupted, my God, yes, it is. And that's the problem with sex. Second thing, when you put it very correctly, and you noticed this already before, I was trying to do, sorry for this arrogant approach, I was trying to do what, as Todd McGowan told me, it happened already decades ago in Vermont with Bernie Sanders. Bernie said once something beautiful. He said that our task is not to play this democratic game of who will get the middle ground votes, you know, this undecided upper classes or whatever. No, we should aim precisely at Trump voters. We should get them, all those impoverished white class people. There are also them, although I know many of them, they are fake workers' friends. There are billionaires and so on. But many of Trump workers are confused, ordinary people. We have to approach them. There is no victory without getting over Trump voters. And that was my aim there. To, as you, Ben, put it very precisely, we should always forget, and this is what many leftists will never forgive me when I pointed out that, yes, Trump is a horror and so on, but Trump is a symptom of the failure of liberal democratic hegemony. In short term, yes, all tactical alliances are necessary to block Trump and so on, but, and even now, okay, immediately I will stop. I just want to commit full suicide and go even a step further. Are you guys following this ongoing conflict between AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and more radical left?
Oh, yes. I'm on a Facebook thread that's nothing but insulting her now.
Yeah.
Sorry, what did you say, Matt?
I'm on a Facebook thread where it's nothing but Marxists who are insulting AOC. In fact, they even took issue with her reading Infinite Jest yesterday. That became an object of conversation.
Yes. No, I understand both sides, but you know what's my problem? Listen, I wrote a lot against Biden. I even used that phrase that I regret a little bit. Biden is just Trump with a human face. I think it's even the opposite up to a point, that Trump stands for some obscene, vulgar humanity. He's like, so maybe Trump is Biden with a human face in this sense, you know? Because Trump is a guy you can immediately establish this vulgar, everyday, obscene humanity, telling dirty jokes. But what I want to say is that what he is doing now, Biden, okay, maybe I should be paranoid and claim what Trump claims, I don't know. That he's just old, senile, and his evil communist, as Trump put it, advisors bring him just measures, papers to sign. But listen, the second big trillion, a couple of trillions program for ecology and so on, then what his treasury person, woman, Janet Yellen proposed. Are we aware that what she proposed is a measure? Probably others did it, but which is also in the list of Piketty, which is that the only way to strengthen working class, blah, 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 is to establish, they will fail, but the idea is correct, is to establish an international taxing system so that in no country the taxes will be lower than 20% and so on and so on. Now, do I think that this is the final solution? No. But in this situation, sorry, I think that with all the critical distance, we know it will fail. We should support these measures. This doesn't mean we capitulate to the establishment, because we know something. We know that if the Biden administration will try to actualize these measures, there will be problem, banks, financial problem, and so we are not hypocrites. I'm not the evil Marxist who pretends to be a Democrat but has his dark plans. Then we will make coup d'etat and so on. No, we should be totally open. We should say we support those measures. Just we warn you, if you will really try to actualize those measures, you will get into trouble and you will have to go further.
Yeah,
so I find crazy in this situation now to go on with this line, no Biden establishment. No, politics is about making accepting that your hands will be dirty. And the position of no contact with Biden, he is the same as Trump, is what I call principled opportunism. You use your principles to occupy this safe position. No, my hands are not dirty. I know in advance things will go wrong. Yes, they will go wrong. But like, I will just tell you this. This is why I wasn't totally dreaming when I said, okay, I provoked with the term communism. You know what what Biden, that COVID will maybe push us a little bit towards communism. But just imagine, before COVID era, could you even imagine measures that is now enacting Biden? You would be proclaimed communist, socialist, whatever, and so on and so on. And that's where I offer my hand to liberals, not equality, we join you, but the message should be, you know what interests me more and more? Did you notice how Trump and also in Europe, Orban in Hungary, it's close to what Orban said 2-3 months ago. I quoted him that liberals don't exist today. Liberals are just communists with a diploma. And that's also Trump's view. Remember when Melania, my great compatriot, was asked about Biden?
You're now probably only the world's second most prominent Slovenian.
Yeah. You know, she answered, Biden is a socialist. And they asked Trump, what about Kamala Harris? And he said, she's worse, she's a communist. You know, and then the stupid metaphor, she wants to open. You know what I like is the irony, was Trump what he was saying? When he said she wants to open the borders to bring all the rapists and murderers from Mexico in, I like this idea. All of a sudden, open borders are a communist principle. Tell this to Soviet Union, you know. Sorry, I will stop now. But you see this complex situation, one shouldn't lose nerves. So this is what really worries me. I think that without strengthening of the left wing, and that's the true struggle here. I like from time to time to hearing his crazy podcast, Steve Bannon, who is aware of this. He said, we should get Bernie Sanders vote, the left votes, you know, and he was even honest here. Steve Bannon said once, we need to raise taxes to 40-50% for the rich and so on. The real struggle is here between more extreme left, more extreme right. And again, my dialogue with Jordan Peterson was about this, but then I will shut up. Can I tell you a wonderful dialogue? When we finished the detail, you see, I'm in spite of all human, but I will tell you why. When we finished the dialogue, I was presented to his daughter, Michaela Peterson. And I read in the media that she gave to her father the idea, eat only beef and so on. And I addressed her, oh, you are the beef girl, no? She not only liked me, but she emailed me time ago, because I consider this fair, when Jordan was really in a desperate situation in Russia and all that bullshit and Serbia, no? I just asked, I don't know which was my contact with Jordan, like, are you doing well? And so on, no? And she answered me, and you know how she signed herself? Beef girl. You know what this reminds me of? Don't now misunderstand me. It's not we are all friends, blah, blah, blah. But this is so horrible about Trump and so on that the political debate is getting so brutal. I think we need civilization which was active in Poland before Kaczynski. Now, the moment you get these guys, Kaczynski, Orban, it's brutality. It fascinates me so much, you know, the big dissident figure in Poland, Adam Michnik. He was the big figure, now he runs the mail. He told me, because I heard the rumor, he told me that General Jaruzelski and him became good friends in the negotiations, like two big opponents. This is less and less possible today with this vulgarity and brutality. Sorry, I stop now.
I just wanted to pick up on a couple of different threads of that. I think the AOC thing is important. I mean, I've got my criticisms of AOC on free speech.
So what is your position here, please? It's important.
Oh, yeah. So like I said, I mean, I do definitely have my criticisms of AOC on free speech and other issues, but I think her presence in Congress,
not her literary taste, though,
is a tremendous. Yes, I actually love Infinite Jest. That makes me like her better. But but I think that her presence in Congress is a tremendous net positive for the left, and I think that, like, when people say, oh, you know, like, I don't think that her strategy, as far as like approaching the Biden administration, is like above reproach. But I do think that that there's a sort of way of standing on the sidelines that kind of misses the point. I mean, like you said, all real politics is messy. You can imagine some of these people in like Russia in 1918 saying like, well, you know, Trotsky seemed good, but then he sold out and he hired all these czarist generals to run the Red Army. You know, like so I guess he's really not on our side after all. I think that, you know, I think that the main thing, right, as my friend Adam Proctor puts it, is that when you have, like, you see these people, like, sure, Bernie lost, the left lost. So this is what losing looks like, that, you know, that when the other side, you know, that like Biden won. So of course, anybody who's in Congress who's trying to push anything, you know, who's not, is going to say some nice things about Biden. And, you know, and I think that's the deal. I think you need to change the political calculation to change that. But I also wanted to address your point about, you know, about the right, you know, about Bannon, because I think, and this actually does kind of bring us back to your debate with Jordan Peterson, because you know, I think about two debates that I watched with Steve Bannon. One of them was the Monk debate that Bannon did in Toronto with David Frum, which was like supposed to be like the really, you know, classy high level thing, which was completely pointless. All it was David Frum throwing rhetoric at Bannon for an hour and accusing him of being a fascist, and Bannon throwing rhetoric at Frum about working class deplorables, and they never actually argued about policy, presumably because they're both Republicans. They basically agree about policy. Whereas when Bannon went on the Red Scare podcast, which a lot of people were very mad at them for having him on, that they're platforming this terrible person, Steve Bannon. I really liked Michael Brooks' comment about that at the time, which was that it was great because even though it was superficially a very friendly interview, the Red Scare girls pushed Bannon on a really on a question that like really cuts through everything, which is, you say that you're a populist. How about Medicare for all? Why don't you support that? And that's even though their demeanor was friendly and flirty and all this stuff. I think that is a much more useful thing for people to see. Whereas I think the reason that a lot of people have a bad reaction to it, the reason a lot of people have a bad reaction to your debate with Peterson, is that what they really want to see is somebody like rhetorically crushing the skulls of their enemies. You know,
the Viking horned helmets.
Yeah. No, people don't get it in what really dangerous situation we are today. And we have to make, but you, Matt, I think we interrupted you a couple of times. Do you have in your city self something to bring out to express?
Oh, no, I just wanted to say we had a joke because I was here in Toronto when the Frum Bannon debate was going on, and the tagline was, which is worse, war crimes or hate crimes, right? These are the two options you have available to you. But I actually had a question for you,
Please.
Which is, I think that there's a real need for an authentic left-wing politics right now. But one of the things that I've always found extremely difficult about mobilizing that is how effectively people like Steve Bannon can appropriate left-wing tropes and rhetoric and use them to agitate for really reactionary and very conservative policies.
Yeah.
And conservatives have a long history of doing this. Like, my God, Margaret Thatcher said she wanted to class the society in the 1980s because, you know, she was going to do away with the aristocrats in the UK, and everyone was going to compete on a level playing field for the scraps, you know, that were left over by neoliberalism. And Bannon has done something very similar. And I think Wendy Brown talked about this really effectively in her latest book on neoliberalism, where she says people like Jordan Peterson are always heckling the left for its resentment-driven politics, right? The poor resent the rich, which is why they're doing. But how else could you characterize Trumpism but a kind of resentment of the powerful towards the weak? You know, how dare you people demand that we provide something like Medicare for all when that's not what we want? But it's a really powerful way to mobilize people that we at the left used to be pretty good at by agitating for justice rather than resentment. But we seem to have lost that ability somewhat recently.
Yes, I see your problem. I deeply agree with you. But here the problem is what to do. Again, Russ, you may remember when I quoted you, I also proposed this line, like, this is where disagreements enter with me and some part of the left who think we should recapture that aggressiveness, mobilize people. But how really? it's a story that I often use, but I like it. You remember crowds entering Capitol? Rush wrote about it, all this aspect of carnival, of stealth, of enjoyment. But isn't it also that the radical left perceived it as if the crowds breaking into Capitol, their enjoyment was stolen from them by the right? Because, some of my friends who watched it, of course, told me, it's wonderful what happened, just we should have done it, the wrong people did it, I don't like this line of thought. I think as I said, I think even with the debate with Peterson, that was my maybe meanest manipulation there. I told him, you remember that. I told him, I totally agree with you with your criticism of this historicist, postmodern relativism. But look, are you aiming at the right target? If there ever was a postmodern historicist, relativist president, it's Donald Trump, my God.
I agree.
If there ever was an authentic, not in a reactionary sense, but how should I call it, an authentic moral majority guy with simple, decent values. It's Bernie Sanders, And we should shamelessly emphasize and accept it. We should renounce here. I also follow another problematic person. I still like her, Angela Nagle, who pointed out, who pointed out all these things that the tragedy today is that the new right appropriated all that I remember as a young guy we the leftists were doing, like all these gestures to those in power, dirty words, as if by behaving indecently with dirty words and so on, you are doing something subversive. No, sorry guys, the right took that over, and the tragedy of the left is that they retreated into, at all levels, into not only political correct rigidity, but even law and order. I don't know how it is in the United States, but now in Germany, in Europe, the left wants, why doesn't police intervene, law and order, and so on and so on. It's a very tragic situation.
Yeah, it's like the Sex Pistols released an album now, "Be God Save the Queen," right?
No, that's like there I have some problems. I also now, but I will tell you something which, okay, I like to make public suicide. Let me make a step further here. Who is the husband? I always confuse this. Who is Charlie? Who is Harry? Is it Harry or who? The husband of Meghan Markle, the prince who?
Harry,
yeah. He said something so stupid. He said, I don't want to be perceived by people as Prince Harry. I want to be seen by them as an ordinary guy. I'm just Harry. Fuck you. But if you are just Harry, nobody would even know about you, listen about you, and so on, There is so if I were to choose between Harry and some non-conformist, I would say just get me rid of Harry, That's totally fake. This is totally wrong perception of how public image authority works. People are interested in his private affairs just because he is a prince. Nobody would have cared about him without that. So I don't believe
the royal family issue is interesting because after because after Meghan Markle made the accusations that she made to Oprah, the royal family in the UK actually appointed a what they called a diversity czar, which, by the way, first of all, is just hilarious that the English royal family is appointing a czar. But the other thing is that
Robin DiAngelo.
Well, that's the other thing, right? Because it's like the ultimate reductio ad absurdum of this kind of politics. Because you're saying that this hereditary royal family isn't diverse enough, that well surely we can fix this, and we can have like a properly diverse royal family that can rule over us. I mean, it's just a parody of this kind of like this kind of woke representational politics that's about that's about making sure that people at the top of the society are internally diverse enough, or at least making sure that decision makers are sensitive enough, that everybody's gone to enough of those Robin DiAngelo HR trainings, but that don't actually impact the distribution of wealth and power in any way. And I do just want to briefly say, because you in that introduction I mentioned earlier to the Peterson book, you mentioned this. You say, and I quote, "If I were to indulge in paranoiac speculations, I would be much more inclined to say that the politically correct obsessive regulations are rather a left liberal plot to destroy an authentic radical left movement. Suffice it to recall the animosity against Bernie Sanders, some LGBTQ plus in feminist circles who had no problems with big corporate bosses supporting them." And this gets us back to the debate with Peterson, because I think that maybe part of what you were trying to do there is to say that there are lots of reasons why somebody would pay attention to Jordan Peterson. Part of it is because of his work as a self-help guru and psychologist, and some people come for the self-help and stay for the politics, but also part of it is that when he's speaking to these culture war preoccupations, a lot of people are very, very annoyed at the people that he's railing against, and he gives you a certain story about how to think about those people, right? That if you find the sort of excesses and stupidities of a certain version of the left irritating, basically join Jordan Peterson and be a cultural conservative who maybe has some genuinely bad views about trans rights and things like that, but also basically wants to tell you to just clean your room and and not worry about trying to change the system. Whereas I think, tell me if this is right, what you're trying to get at there is, no, you can be equally annoyed by the stupidities and excesses of a certain version of the left, and without becoming a cultural conservative. You can just become, you can just be like a sort of culturally relaxed radical leftist who's going to be an alternative to both of those things.
No, I totally agree with you here. And it's not just you can be a leftist. I would go even a step further. And you will say, I would say that the only way to be a true radical leftist is to be in the sense that you implied now, culturally tolerant, or however you call this, and so on. Because the first thing about culture, this is what gets lost with these political correct rules and so on and so on. Listen, Adorno, the big guy, Frankfurt School, said once after World War II, when Hays Code was still reigning in Hollywood, he said a truly great work of art would have respected all the Hays Code rules, but not because of oppression, but because of immanent necessity and so on. And I will apply this in the opposite sense, and I can tell you about this. It's my old example. Racism is not a matter, cannot be measured by precise statements. You end up with the same obscenity. It's horrible. When in Europe, I don't know if you have the same problem in the United States, in Germany, they want to keep the Holocaust studies open, but at the same time, they want to put some limits on it. I agree with it. You cannot be a Holocaust denier and so on and so on. So did you know that what the result was? That they tried to quantify it, and the image which appeared was 5 million. If you claim Nazis killed 4,900,000 Jews, it's okay. No, sorry, you are already off. You are anti-Semite. If you say it was just a little bit over 5 million, that's what you get into. But I claim that, again, here we, as Lacan would have put it, racism is a matter of style, implication. You can make jokes which are apparently racist, but they can work as a means of solidarity. You can respect all PC rules, but the way you respect them can be extremely patronizing and racist.
Yeah.
So as an old Hegelian, I say, you know what we need?
Yeah.
Then I will have to drop you. I'm collapsing. I often use it now recently. You know that old joke, Russell, you must keep the list, how often I used it. Sam Goldwyn, you know, when he got the message from the press that you are using too many old cliches in your movies, and his message to his scenario department, we urgently need new cliches, you know. That's what we need today. Not just new rules how to control our lives, but to invent new, what Hegel called with this wonderful word, Sitten, customs, spontaneous mores, and so on and so on. Would you kill me if I now do in a polite, non-racist way this to you, because I'm dropping? But one remark before I finish, you can cut, bend this on, how it's nice here how people can immediately see our intellectual levels here. Russell is the big intellectual, look, full book of shells behind. The two of you, Matt and Ben, are so-so, while I'm with half empty shelves. I'm people, you know, whatever we say in the very materiality of our debate, people get the message.
Well, first of all, that before you leave, that's not true, because I've stolen everything from Slavoj, so that's one thing. No, but the second, before you leave, Slavoj.
No, this is what reactionaries say. You know why? You are preparing your defense. When democratic fascist forces will take over and you will be accused, you will say, no, it wasn't me. I just stole it from Slavoj and so on. Exactly. You are preparing your defense.
All right, great. Two things quickly before you leave. One, I want to go back to this thing about the question of platforming, because which was the response that a lot of people had when the debate with Peterson was announced. I mean, I know you and I went to the debate together, but we were talking before it, and the amount of people who I'm sure you heard from, that I heard from, that you shouldn't do this, and it was giving Peterson a platform, and it was like, just from a numbers standpoint, if you see, how many, I mean, within the academy, Slavoj is very well known and the books sell well, but Peterson at the time was this sort of cultural phenomenon. It was making all this money on. So the idea,
even just to interject right now, I think if you look at Amazon's list of the 100 most sold books in the last week, I believe 12 Rules for Life is still there. I've got bad news. The Sublime Object of Ideology is not going to be one of the 100 most sold books on Amazon.
Yeah, of course.
Last week.
Yeah, but nonetheless, on the other hand, it exposed me to many people outside our narrow circle. When you say, Russ, I'm well known, but as you, Ben, were right to point out now, my popularity is not only very much under threat now, attacked from all sides, but also it's a very limited popularity. And I think it was important to reach to a wider circle of people.
Well,
in this sense, we both used each other, me and Jordan.
Well, this was the second thing that I wanted to say, was that in the couple of moments in the debate when you went after him, actually, it wasn't on, because everything, like the interview that you were talking about that he did, where all of these, there was a whole panel of people, LGBTQ going, is that you didn't go after him on solely the cultural grounds, which I think is a lot what most like left liberals were doing, and actually put pressure on something that he says, like cultural postmodern neo-Marxism. And when you asked him, who are these
I know he came with Foucault and
Derrida. And you said, I can give you some, like David Harvey, Fred Jameson, some actual Marxists. But the idea that, I think the problem is that actually, like, the people on liberals who thought that Peterson is attacking them with this, actually think that they're cultural Marxists, which is a complete ridiculous. There aren't many actual Marxists in the academy.
No,
that you were making.
Very few. You know where I had my formative experience, in this sense? I remember over 20, almost 30 years ago, when me and John Kopjek were part of the October, then we had a split, we stepped out. I asked the obvious, some of the people, I think was even Rosalind Krauss, I don't know who No, it wasn't her, another member of the inner circle. I asked them a simple question. The answer was obvious, but I wanted to hear the answer was, listen, to what does the title October really refer to? And I got it, it's that one. It's the October era. It's that October revolution. But my God, it's totally meaningless. They're not in any sense Marxist and so on. It's just flirting with radicality and so on. But I don't see any sense in which they could be proclaimed Marxist and so on and so on. And you were right. I'm totally confused. Was it you, Ben, or you, Russell? You are all the same shit for me. I don't. What I want to say is that you are right. No, it was you, Russell. That people, we have a paradox of people not who pretend not to be Marxist, but secretly sell their subversive messages, but people who think that they are Marxists, It's an incredible phenomenon,
Yeah. I also will say, just on the Peterson debate, I think like a very useful, I like what I think you were doing there, as we talked about. I also think that Peterson was being very helpful in scoring all these own goals by not being able to name any postmodern Marxists and by saying like that even though he's gone around for years, publicly denouncing Marxism all the time, that he just like reread the Communist Manifesto for the first time in decades. That's I think the combination of that and a very friendly approach from you is about the best outcome we could have hoped for that debate. But I know you have to go, so I just want to quickly say if you there was a question. Forrest, do we have any?
Yes, I see you.
So there's two quick ones. I got one from a Facebook message and I got one from the chat. So the first question is like, what should people do to stay motivated?
Oh my God, this is the base. Okay, I cannot give a very brief answer, like half a minute I will try. This is the big problem today with COVID crisis and so on. I don't know how it's with you guys, but in Europe, it's kind of a generalized depression. We don't, a year ago, the first wave of COVID was almost retroactively to us today. I experienced, there was something liberating. It was clear. COVID, risk, we have to obey the rules, you transgress the rules, but it was a clear situation. Now in Europe, it's a kind of a depression. There is no clear, as Fred Jameson put it, cognitive mapping, no clear perspective, and people don't know what to expect. So even this motivation of let's survive, and here I think Agamben is wrong, It's not true that we are even survivalists now. It's a kind of a general depression and so on. And here I would go even a step further. Maybe something good will come out of it because the very logic of capitalist desire, capitalist motivation is threatened now. Like my colleague Alenka Zupancic and Mladen Dolar, both other members of our Ljubljana Troika, pointed out, I think, how we usually designate capitalism as hysterical. You buy a commodity, but you again and again discover that's not it. You buy another thing. But no, today it's not, consumerism is not hysterical. It's like a perverted position. You know in advance that you will be disappointed. Nobody really expects if I buy that book, that product, those shoes, it will be the thing in itself. And then, oh, you are disappointed. It's not that. No, you know it in advance. But even that game is now falling apart. So to answer your question, not directly, but in a more confused way, like, yes, there is a crisis of motivation, but something good may come out of it because we will not only have to reinvent how to achieve what we want. We will have to reinvent at its most basic hour, to use the Kantian term, Begehrenskraft. Kant doesn't use it, the ability to desire. So, yes.
Talk about anticipatory disappointment.
Yeah, but it's part of the game. That's crazy. That you know in advance you will be disappointed, but nonetheless you play the game. But first you had another one. You said question.
Oh, yeah, I had a second question that somebody asked. They said, given the recent surge in authoritarianism across the globe in the past decade or so, wealth inequality and like the ubiquity of neoliberal economic policies, do you have any hope that organized civilized society as we know it will continue for more than a century or so?
My position is mixed here. You know, I don't buy this usual leftist paranoia that the COVID crisis is exaggerated, blown out of proportion, used by the big corporation to establish total control and so on. Look at the United States. Let's make it clear. Nonetheless, Trump lost probably only because of COVID. Without COVID, he would probably have been triumphantly re-elected. And look also around in India, with this terrible situation they're in now. Maybe there is a chance that that Narendra Modi will begin to lose his power and so on and so on. So again, I think that it works both ways. It's an open situation. That's why I always fanatically repeat, my enemies are those who think, now we have to stand back. It's a purely medical healthcare situation. No, it's not. We never in our lives did we live in such a politicized moment as we do live in it now. And why am I still optimist? Precisely because I'm a catastrophist. You know, people saying, but now maybe the new corporate order and vaccination, blah, blah, blah. Yes, but first, numbers are not falling as we hoped. Second point, there are other crises to come, believe me. You know, there will be ecological crisis, global warming, and so on and so on. So that's my paradox. I'm an optimist because I'm a pessimist. I see dark perspectives. The emergency state will go on. And because of this, I believe that at some point a miracle will happen. A local miracle first. You know how many miracles we did see in the last decade? Yes, there were marginal miracles, but they did work. Who would have expected something like Syriza in Greece? Who would have expected something like, with all its limitations, as Occupy Wall Street and so on and so on? There is a discontent growing. What worries me, I've written about this, is that there is, but this is also maybe a hope for something new, but very dangerous moment that, look, I always take as example yellow vests in France. There is an incredible level of discontent, but obviously it cannot be adequately transferred into represented in our established political system. So we have a gap between political representation and discontent. A discontent, explosive discontent is forming, and the big question of the future will it be the right-wing populists who will be most successful in politicizing this discontent, or will the left also find a way? But I don't have a clear answer here. I am open, you know, I'm a late Hegelian who thinks what we do always leads to unpredictable consequences. Nobody is in this naive sense the subject of history, as classical Marxists tended to be. You know, you look at history, you see what is objectively necessary, proletarian revolution, you do it, and so on. No, we live in an unpredictable world. This is our limitation, but this is also our hope, I mean.
Well, I don't think there was one other thing we were going to do before you left, but you've been extraordinarily generous with your time, and that's and I think that last is probably as good a note to end on as we're going to get. So thank you so much, Slavoj. All right. So that was Slavoj yeah, we got to clear the bookshelves at the beginning, and how Russell's going to sell them out when the fascists come. But in any case, all of that is just preface. The main event is to get through as much as we reasonably can without staying up too late tonight, of the 2019 debate that he did with Jordan Peterson. Yes. Well, we're going to skip this part because we want to get right to the beginning of the debate. It's long enough as it is, but the moderator does say at the beginning that that scalpers were selling tickets to this thing for more than Maple Leafs tickets, which is incredible.
I've lived here for about 6-7 years at a time, and I've never once been able to afford to get Leaf tickets. Not once. So that really tells you something.
Yeah, no, for sure. But yeah, so I should say that the alleged subject of the debate is happiness, capitalism versus Marxism, which is essentially a very strange topic. I did a video about this for Zero Books before the debate, when it was first announced, but it sort of sets off all of the most annoying and pedantic parts of my personality, hearing something like that is like, wait a second, right? Because one, Marxism and capitalism, there's a category mistake there, right? that should be socialism and capitalism, or Marxism and, I don't know, pro-capitalist ideology. But Marxism is a philosophical view about capitalism and other things, but it's anyway. And then happiness is weird because both debaters are on record as saying that happiness is not what you should be, trying to aim at as such, especially Žižek.
But the difference between them on that, why is interesting. Even though, I agree the topic is weird.
Yeah, no, that's so. I mean, I think they could have had an interesting debate about how to think about happiness, like that. I actually, it would have been completely different from this one, but a sort of. I mean, essentially, the debate they could have had would essentially have been Lacan versus Jung, which which would have been interesting. I'd have watched that, but what they did have was interesting in its own completely different way, because what they were essentially debating was Marxism, what should we think about it? The left, how should we think about it? Is postmodern neo-Marxism, Peterson's bugbear a thing? Those were really the topics that they were debating.
Yeah.
Open question: how many cigarettes Lacan would have actually smoked if he ever actually debated Jung? I imagine it would probably have been an unprecedented number, because I don't think I've ever fucking seen him in a picture where he's not smoking something.
Yeah, that debate would not have happened.
Yeah, it's true.
No amount of cigarettes probably would have bribed Lacan to debate Jung, but it is true. Every picture of Lacan.
Yeah, just sit there and be like, hey, listen, I imagine it's difficult to get camels in France. We'll give you 2 packs, carry you through a couple hours.
Yeah,
fair enough. There hasn't been. There was a Dangerous Method, which was about Jung to a great extent. I don't think there's been a Lacan movie, but I don't know.
Dangerous Method was pretty good. I mean, if you're going to get a movie about psychoanalysis, David Cronenberg is the guy to do it.
Yeah, that's true. I haven't seen it in years. I remember seeing it in theaters, but the Lacan movie is long past due, because he probably rivaled Jung for being a character. Yeah,
I was at a conference where Stephen Frosch, I think his name was, who's a Lacanian theorist, was telling me that at one point there was a woman who came in for her session, and he took the money from her and then told her that they were done for the day because just wasn't feeling it right now, and she should come back later on. And she went outside and she said that she thought that she was cheated for 30 minutes until she realized that she was no longer focusing on her psychological problems. She was just pissed off at Lacan, and she was wondering whether or not he was some kind of genius or just a complete hack. And I was like, well, it's a good question.
this was the biggest point of contention between, which basically got Lacan, kicked out. Was the most controversial part among Freudians was this variable time of the session, which was sacrosanct for under Freud. But yeah,
it wasn't like 3 hours or something with him.
I don't remember the exact time.
Lacan is the 15-minute hour guy.
Or no time.
Or right.
Yeah, or no time.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. I like Dangerous Method. David Cronenberg, if you're watching this, I assume you are. Think about making a Lacan movie. I'd watch it.
And Cass Viggo Mortensen in the main role. We all know we want it.
Yeah, actually, I saw an interview with Cronenberg around the time Dangerous Method came out, where the interviewer asked him about making a movie about the book Love and Capital, which I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. It's about Karl and Jenny Marx, and Cronenberg was like kind of playing with it for a minute in the interview. He was like, "Yeah, actually, that'd be cool." So,
he did a Don DeLillo adaptation. What was it? Cosmopolis with Robert Pattinson. That was really good.
I didn't see it. Was it worth seeing?
I think it was worth seeing. Like, I'll admit, when I saw it, I was like, "Oh, Robert Pattinson, he's the Twilight dude." That was the movie that convinced me. I'm like, "Oh, he can actually do more than that," because the book is pretty fucked up, and the movie does not shy away from some of the weirder themes. So, yeah, I'd say watch it. Not great, but definitely worth a look.
All right, fair enough. Well, let's at least see if we can get through and comment on the opening statements at least before the end of tonight. So, no further ado.
Let's get underway. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jordan Peterson for the first opening statement.
Ugh, I forgot how much this annoyed me. Okay, I'm going to get another drink.
Well, thank you for that insanely enthusiastic welcome for the entire event and also for being here. I have to tell you first that this event, and I suppose my life in some sense, hit a new milestone that I was just made aware of by a stagehand today backstage, who informed me that last week the tickets for this event were being scalped online at a higher price than the tickets for the Leafs playoff games. So I don't know what to make of that. That's all right. So how did I prepare for this? I familiarized myself to the degree that it was possible with Slavoj Zizek's work, and that wasn't that possible because he has a lot of work and he's a very original thinker, and this debate was put together in relatively short order. And what I did instead was return to what I regarded as the original cause of all the trouble, let's say, which was the Communist Manifesto. And what I attempted to do, because that's Marx, and
the manifesto was the cause of all the immiseration in the world.
And what I tried to do was read it.
Yeah, that's right.
And to read something, you don't just follow the words and follow the meaning, but you take apart the sentences and you ask yourself at this level of phrase and at the level of sentence and at the level of paragraph, is this true? Are there counter arguments that can be put forward that are credible? Is this solid thinking? And I have to tell you, and I'm not trying to be flippant here, that I have rarely read a tract. Now, I read it when I was 18. It was a long time ago. Like that's 40 years ago. But I've rarely read a tract that made as many errors per sentence, conceptual errors per sentence, as the Communist Manifesto. It was quite a miraculous reread. It was interesting to think about it psychologically as well, because I've read student papers that were of the same ilk in some sense, although I'm not suggesting that they were of the same level of glittering literary brilliance and polemic quality. And I also understand that the Communist Manifesto was a call for revolution and not a standard logical argument. But that notwithstanding, I have some things to say about the authors psychologically. The first thing is that it doesn't seem to me that either Marx or Engels grappled with this particular fundamental truth, which is that almost all ideas are wrong. And so and it doesn't matter if they're your ideas or someone else's ideas, they're probably wrong. And even if they strike you with the force of brilliance, your job is to assume, first of all, that they're probably wrong, and then to assault them with everything you have in your arsenal and see if they can survive. And what struck me about...
I don't want to stop every 2 minutes, but I just can't help myself here. Is Peterson claiming that he's done this with his argument about lobsters and hierarchy?
I've often wondered that myself, yeah.
Oh, you're muted, Russ.
Sorry, my screen spazzed out for a minute. What's so funny about this to me is that this is like this is actually the version that you get of critiques of Marxism itself for being too sort of it's like hermeneutics of suspicion, like too skeptical. So the idea, like, you could actually, like, this is a caricature of a bad version of critique that he's talking about here, which is rigorous. Like, I just think of, like, this is like if a student wanted to write a bad sort of parody of, a critique for everything existing. This is like, if Marx wasn't dead already, her hearing this would have definitely killed him.
Yeah. I want to say, like, one of the ironies of this is Marx and Engels actually did write this in their 20s, so they wouldn't actually be that far away from undergraduates around the time when this was drafted. So that in itself is quite an accomplishment. But like he says, it wasn't intended to be a rigorous analytical work in political or economic theory. It was meant to be basically a short little pamphlet that was primarily going to be useful for its literary value and the kind of excitement it generated. And it was. I mean, everybody remembers the passages from it about everything that is solid melts into the air, or workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chain, or even the specters is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. But I think, and we'll dive into this later on with the text, that there actually is a lot that's extremely argumentatively interesting in the text, not least of which is the kind of dialectical approach he takes to capitalism, which Peterson himself acknowledges later on, where he's like, well, I just don't understand why he has so many nice things to say about capitalism and why it's so productive. And then he goes on to trash it in another moment. It's like, well, that might be kind of the point, right?
Yeah, right. That he certainly, as he makes very clear in the rest of this opening statement, like he should have taken some more time with the Communist Manifesto. He didn't understand it at all. I'm not being the guy who says that if you don't agree with something, you don't understand it. I just mean, like, when he says things like, I don't understand how they're, like, acknowledging all this stuff about capitalism, he really is deeply not getting the point.
Yeah. And, I also think that, I taught, Ben, I was telling you, I think I told both of you guys this. I taught the manifesto in class on Thursday. And so I reread it for the umpteenth time. But, and Matt is right. I mean, it's a manifesto, so it doesn't have the, the sort of philosophical complexity or subtlety that a lot of Marx's, major works, or other major works do. But, it just kind of reiterates, reading it again, sort of Peterson's inability to, like, Ben, the point you made about, or was it Matt? I forget, about, why is he praising capital so much? And it's like, well, if you knew anything about the genealogy of this thought, there's a reason why, you'll see a lot of, genealogies of capitalism that go sort of Adam Smith, Ricardo, Marx. I mean, he's a brilliant analyst. I mean, Marx is a brilliant analyst of capital and gives capital its due often. But just, they're nonetheless in that text. I mean, there are a number of nuggets and tidbits where, if you know about, the German ideology, or about, volumes 1 and 2 of Capital, or the Grundrisse. I mean, he gives you a theory of ideology in, like, one paragraph that takes the whole the German ideology to articulate. But Peterson is sort of he seems to be so sort of just ignorant of Marxism itself that he doesn't, everything goes over his head, I think.
Yeah, and I'd also just say, like, again, I just can't get over how unself-aware this is. Like when Peterson is the world master of making these like sweeping statements in super forceful ways and not like responding to any of the obvious objections that anybody could make to any of them, that like, it's bad that left wants to get away from existing social hierarchies because hierarchy is so deep in our nature that we share it with the lobster, which, like, above and beyond everything else that's wrong with that, there's the point that Natalie Wynn made in her classic video about Peterson, which is that you could trot this out at any point in history and it would be an equally good or equally bad argument. You could have the antebellum Jordan Peterson saying this about the hierarchy of masters and slaves. You could have the 18th century Jordan Peterson saying it about Jacobins who want to rip down the hierarchy of king, lords, and commons. Like it's just totally, vacuous, right? Because it's just a defense of hierarchy per se. But of course, what the left actually says is never we should get rid of all hierarchy. Nobody, whatever. I know there was the Cicero line about how there's no proposition so absurd that hasn't been defended by some philosopher. So I'm sure you could find like one guy somewhere who disagrees with this, but like nobody on the left thinks that like it's not acceptable to have like hierarchies between parents and toddlers. So if the toddler wants to run into traffic, you got to just let him. That's not a position anybody holds. The typical lefty position, and even anarchists whose whole thing is being anti-hierarchy, don't hold that position typically. The more typical lefty position is like the Chomsky quote about how hierarchies should be viewed with suspicion. They should have to prove, the burden of proof should be against them. They should have to justify themselves, but that's just a completely different thing. And then the evolutionary arguments are stupid, whatever. It's all ridiculous. But the point is that Peterson says all this stuff super confidently. He never once addresses the many, many objections that people make to it. Whereas Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, like, how much of their lives did they spend getting into the weeds and arguing with, with Proudhon, arguing with Bakunin, arguing with like all of these people who disagreed with them about the finer points of all of their shit, for that matter, like there's the famous, like the preface after the Paris Commune where they say, okay, here's the stuff in the Communist Manifesto that we now think doesn't hold up, but here's what we still think does. Like these were people who spent decades seriously engaging with critics. So, I mean, this is just coming from Peterson. I find this amazing.
Yeah. Their entire life was dedicated to that. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. I mean, right. I mean, Marx was spending, he'd go out for the occasional raucous night of drinking and he'd find time to, for
apparently he destroyed a lamppost in London once. You can still go see it.
I've read that letter. Yeah. That's awesome. I love that thing. It like reminds me of like it's like, one of the greatest geniuses who've ever lived, acted very much like I remember some of the more unsavory nights from when I was in grad school. It's but when he wasn't doing that, what was he doing? He was in the reading room at the British Library, poring over bourgeois economists, to try to construct this elaborate imminent critique of everything that they thought. Like, you can disagree with him, you can think he came to the wrong conclusions, but he certainly can't claim that he didn't seriously engage with what people who disagreed thought.
Oh yeah, I would even go further and say that if you actually read the German ideology today, that maybe about 30 pages of it was really interesting to me when I went through it. And then there's just hundreds and hundreds of pages talking about Max Stirner and criticizing him and analyzing him every which way. And by the end of it, you realize that there's big problems with German idealism. And people very rarely acknowledge this about Marx. Like, he was really dedicated to engaging in the philosophical debates of his time. And sometimes it could actually almost make it difficult to go through his books unless you're really embedded in an understanding of those debates.
Yeah, because you need to know who he's arguing against, because it's very frequently the case in Marx and Engels' writing that there's stuff that reads differently out of context, because it's like, oh yeah, you need to know who this like obscure mid-19th century German socialist was that he was obsessed with refuting that week.
But what frustrates me also is, like, he makes the claim like, well, you know, they make so many mistakes per page and it's really, really bad. But Marx is actually one of the most self-critical people in the social sciences at the time that I'm cognizant of. It's worth noting that he actually published relatively little during his lifetime, precisely because he was so continuously revising, fixing, fine-tuning a lot of his arguments. You know, with the exception of a handful of books and then Das Kapital Volume 1, right? Almost all the stuff that we're familiar with that he wrote came out posthumously and was edited by Engels. And it's also a testament to his kind of methodological convictions, because Marx is a dialectical materialist, knows that you can't just sit there and come up with some idealist conceptual scheme and then say, here's my methodology, now take it and run with it. You always have to talk about how things are practically changing in front of you, which, as anybody who's written a book will know, can be really difficult because the world is fucking changing in front of you all the time. And when you're trying to write to keep up with that, it can be a bit of a challenge, especially when things are changing as rapidly as they are under 19th century capitalism.
Yeah.
Well, this is Well, I mean, this is just the last thing I want to say before we go back to the debate. But the to Matt's point about Marx's self-critique. I mean, if you read the German ideology and then you read Volume 1 of Capital, you will see an evolution in his very theory of ideology. Earlier in German ideology, it's ideology causes everything to as though the world is upside down in a camera obscura, right? And so what we need to do is actually demystify, and then everything will be right side up. And then when he gets to the theory of commodity fetishism and the commodity form later in Capital, it's at the level of the means of production. And so you can't, it's not that there is a sort of, non-ideologically or non sort of jaundiced view that you just sweep away ideology and it's there. Ideology is built into the very fabric of our material existence. And he articulates that much differently in Capital and later on. And so the idea that you could just look at something like the manifesto and this stands for Marxism, to court, I think is that's it's a big problem, as Peterson would say. That's a problem.
Well, one of the things that I want to point out that I actually think that this book does in a fascinating way is they're talking about or the discussion of capitalism as a revolutionary mode of production, which is upending the whole sacred world that existed before, kind of destroying the old feudal aristocracy and its kind of religious ideologies and replacing it with new ideologies and new forms of social hierarchy. Because one of the things that Peterson quite consistently will try to do as a right-wing critic of modernity is argue for a certain kind of traditionalism, and typically associating this with arguments about controlled decadence and decline. But he never actually takes this very Marxist point seriously, that if he actually wants to know why our society has changed very fundamentally, maybe the fact that we have a mode of production that's fundamentally transformative at its very core plays a certain role in that. What's really unfortunate is there are better conservative thinkers out there who are actually cognizant of this problem and take it really seriously. And if he had bothered to actually crack a book that was more than 40 pages, he might have been aware of this and thought there might actually be some things I could draw upon from this in an interesting way, much like Slavoj draws upon a lot of conservative thinkers in very interesting and obviously critical ways. Yeah, no, for sure. I did just want to say on your earlier point about Marx's self-criticism. I mean, his line about the process of, maybe Engels said this, but I think it was Marx, about the process of writing the German ideology. They said we never intended to publish it. We just wanted to write it to get clear in our own minds and then leave it to the gnawing criticism of the rats.
Yeah.
So
that's funny.
All right, let's see if we can at least get through a couple more minutes before it gets to be too much again.
I do that thing. Like he's got a good way with his hands. You see that? He's like, they look like big, good, strong hands. You know.
No, I mean, like hey, I was as somebody who constantly talks with my hands. I respect it. Somebody was pointing that out on Twitter about my debate with Gene Epstein, that I was like nonstop talking with my hands. I was like, look, guys. I'm part Jewish and part Croatian, and Croatians are basically just Italians who speak a Slavic language. I talk with my hands all the time.
I was going to say, it's Italian as an Italian. Yeah, if you tied my hands behind my back, I couldn't talk.
I'm Irish, so we're apparently the only people who are immune to psychoanalysis. You know,
I watched The Departed too.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, you go.
But the Communist Manifesto was akin to something Jung said about typical thinking, and this was the thinking of people who weren't trained to think. He said that the typical thinker has a thought that appears to them like an object might appear in a room. The thought appears, and then they just accept it as true. They don't go the second step, which is to think about the thinking. And that's the real essence of critical thinking. And so that's what you try to teach people in universities, to read a text and to think about it critically, not to destroy the utility of the text, but to separate the wheat from the chaff.
Am I the only one who hears him like echoing?
Manifesto was to separate the wheat.
Let me try muting myself.
And I'm afraid
I mean, it sounds pretty epic, wheat, but
yes, but mostly chaff.
Yeah, that's better.
And I'm going to explain why, hopefully in relatively short order. So I'm going to outline 10 of the fundamental axioms of the Communist Manifesto. And so these are truths that are basically held as self-evident by the authors. And they're truths that are presented in some sense as unquestioned. And I'm going to question them and tell you why.
I'm not going to keep doing this, but none of these are treated as axioms. None of what he's about to say are treated as axiomatic or self-evident or anything like that in the text.
Yeah, I just can't get over, and I'm not trying to, I just can't get over the idea that Marx, who wanted to submit everything to existing to a ruthless critique and specifically asking you to think beyond the way that the world is currently structured, or to sort of see, behind it, things that have been naturalized that are actually not, transcendent truths or transcendent elements of human nature. I mean, Marx does talk about, that it's for instance, for Marx, it's an inherent human trait to create and to build and to make things. But the idea that the most critical thinker of the 19th century, who even more so than I would say even Hegel, who is known, who there wouldn't be Marx without Hegel. Marx is the embodiment of critical thinking. So the idea that Marx, just espouses these things
right down to the beard, right? Necessary beard.
It's crazy. It's just crazy.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, I understand. I mean, the Communist Manifesto, it's not analytic philosophy. You're not like spelling out like, okay, here are exactly the premises and how I'm getting from it. It's written in a much more literary way. But I'm just the idea that like it's just lazy. Everything that like he's just taking a bunch of claims that either in some cases Marx and Engels make in the manifesto, in some cases he thinks are somehow implied by what they say in the manifesto, because he's going to say things in what follows as axioms that are nowhere in the text.
Yeah.
And in some cases, just stuff that he thinks he knows about communism. So he's attributing to Marx and Engels the manifesto, and he's just going to jumble it all together and claim that every single one of these, which is, the what's wrong with what we're about to see. But like, it's something that bothers me a lot as a pedantic nerd who is pained by misdescribed arguments. But anyway, let's watch.
I did actually just want to say, because I think this is actually an important methodological point that you're making, Ben, which is that one of the things that Marx and dialectical theorists are criticized more than anything else by analytical philosophers for is precisely the fact that they don't rely on axiomatic premises. Everything always seems to be in motion and constant flux. And sometimes this is even parodied. If you think about, the kind of lampooning of Hegel's A equals A, but sometimes non kind of approach to things, right? And you can see this manifested in the Communist Manifesto, where one of the things they're talking about is precisely the fact that you can't actually make a purely normative critique of capitalism, precisely because capitalism is a new epoch in human history that's emerged because of various incredibly complex factors. And we also can't even put a pin on what the new society is going to look like because it's moving in front of our eyes, right? So this entire idea of imposing a kind of axiomatic structure onto this book really misunderstands the logic, the Hegelian logic, to invoke Russ, that's operating within it. Which isn't to say you can't criticize it. I mean, a good Rawlsian liberal socialist like myself would love a few more axioms in Marx, about his kind of normative commitments and stuff. But that's not what he's doing. Right?
Yeah, certainly the way that Peterson's reading it. I mean, whatever else you think about the logical structure of it, it just could not be more foreign to the spirit in which the manifesto is being written.
Yeah.
I think they're unreliable. Now, we should remember that this tract was actually written 170 years ago. That's a long time ago. And we have learned a fair bit from since then about human nature, about society, about politics, about economics. There's lots of mysteries left to be unsolved, but we are slightly wiser, I presume, than we were at one point. And so you can forgive the authors to some degree for what they didn't know, but that doesn't matter given that the essence of this doctrine is still held as sacrosanct by a large proportion of academics, probably are among the most, what would you call, guilty of that particular sin. So here's proposition number one. History is to be viewed primarily as an economic class struggle. All right, so let's think about that for a minute. The first of all is the proposition there is that history is
just stop for 1 sec.
to be viewed through an economic lens.
I do want to be a little fair to him here because I think the argument that Marx is an economic reductionist is now widely disproven. And Engels actually wrote a letter, I think it was in 1897, maybe it's somewhat different, where he said, we tended to overemphasize the economic point precisely to try to deny our opponents who didn't want to talk about the economic foundation of society at all and just kind of treat it in the way that liberal ideologues tend to treat it, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, there is no doubt that at times, in this text at least, he does write like an economic reductionist. So if all you were coming into this debate with was the Communist Manifesto, you might be given to that kind of interpretation.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's a decent point. But I'm interested. It might be. I think that it is sort of. There's no ill will behind it. But he sort of sneaks economic class struggle. It doesn't. The text does not say economic class struggle. It says class struggle, and it's the economic system, the epoch in which we currently are in, the capitalist epoch, that actually enables us to see that the history of all history heretofore has been a history of class struggle. So I don't know. Maybe that's a too nitpicky point.
Well, I mean, I think that again. I mean, to go back to the methodological point. Like literally, he's just saying, well, the first sentence, is of the bourgeois and proletarians chapter, it's not the first sentence of the whole thing, but the first sentence when the main thing starts going is about the history of all hitherto existing history being the history of class struggle. Therefore, Marx and Engels must think that this is a self-evident truth, and that's just like a bizarre logical leap, right. Like just like that. That's just like a weird way to interpret a text that like whatever the first thing that an author says at the beginning, and I think is a self-evident truth.
Well, right, like if anything, it's not self-evident. That's the whole point of writing the manifesto. Not the whole point, but that's a major point, is that these things are not commonsensical or self-evident.
Well, actually, I want to say I found the piece by Engels. It was actually 1890, and it does really testify to their capacity for self-criticism because And it's really cute. So I actually want to read the quote. So it's 1890 from Engels to J. Block, where he says, Marx and I are partly to blame for the fact that the younger people sometimes lay more stress on the economic side than is due to it. We had to emphasize the main principle vis-a-vis our adversaries who denied it. And we had not always the time, the place, or the opportunity to give their due to the other elements involved in interaction. I'll post the link if people are interested. Just, I think it just is a really real testament to the fact that even in 1890, Engels was still saying, you know, work in progress. We're doing the best that we can. We're only human, and we were constantly revising our ideas. Right?
Yeah. All right.
And I think that's a debatable proposition, because there are many other motivations that drive human beings than economics, and those have to be taken into account, especially that drive people other than economic competition, like economic cooperation, for example. And so that's a problem. The other problem is that it's actually not nearly a pessimistic enough description of the actual problem, because history, this is to give the devil his due. The idea that one of the driving forces between history is hierarchical struggle is absolutely true. But the idea that that's actually history is not true, because it's deeper than history. It's biology itself, because organisms of all sorts organize themselves into hierarchies. And one of the problems with hierarchies is that they tend to arrange themselves into a winner-take-all situation. And so, and that is implicit in some sense in Marxist thinking, because of course Marx believed that in a capitalist society, capital would accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And that actually is in keeping with the nature of hierarchical organizations. Now, the problem with that isn't so much the fact of, so there's accuracy in the accusation that that is a eternal form of motivation for struggle, but it's an underestimation of the seriousness of the problem, because it attributes it to the structure of human societies rather than the deeper reality of the existence of hierarchical structures per se, which, as they also characterize the animal kingdom to a large degree, are clearly not only human constructions. And the idea that there's hierarchical competition among human beings, there's evidence for that that goes back at least to the Paleolithic times. And so that's the next problem. It's that, well, this ancient problem of hierarchical structure is clearly not attributable to capitalism, because it existed long in human history before capitalism existed, and then it predated human history itself. So the question then arises, why would you necessarily, at least implicitly, link the class struggle with capitalism, given that it's a far deeper problem? And now it's also, you've got to understand that this is a deeper problem for people on the left, not just for people on
as much as I don't want to do 5 minutes every time there's 5 seconds of Jordan Peterson talking, you know, this is just too amazing not to not to comment on.
Only under capitalism, Ben, has there been class struggle.
Yeah, well, and clearly Marx and Engels believe that only under capitalism does hierarchy and class struggle exist. You know how I know that Marx and Engels believe that only under capitalism has this existed? Because the sentence after the one that he's calling an axiom about how the all hitherto exist in history is the history of class struggle, starting in the next. This is literally the next sentence after that one. I know he read that sentence because he called it one of his axioms. This is the next sentence, and I quote. Freeman, so the history of all hitherto existent society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman. In a word, oppressor and oppressed stood in opposition to each other, etc., etc., etc. It's a long sentence, but like in that sentence, Marx and Engels are talking about feudalism. Lord and serf. They're talking about sort of early commercial and sort of mercantilist in a society with that business about guildmen and journeymen. They're talking about ancient Rome, patrician and plebeian. So there seems to be quite a lot, literally, in the next sentence, like the second sentence of, chapter 1, chapter 1, sentence 2. They do seem to be aware of the existence of hierarchies in pre-capitalist societies.
Yeah, but Ben, now I mean those he wasn't talking. Marx and Engels, they weren't talking about actual like pre-existing history. They were talking about all the different identitarian positions that people have taken under capitalism, like plebeian, serf. They're just identity categories under capitalism.
Yeah. That's right. They I think right afterwards it's I think that's the way the sentence ends, right? It's it's lord and serf, patrician and plebeian, guildmaster and journeyman. All of these are identities that need to be recognized in the intersectional complexity of social justice, which will only be achieved, when everybody has to say the correct, it's total nonsense. And I think what most offends me about this is it's okay, it's bad enough that you are going to charge all these nice people who watch so much to watch this debate, and that I
watch it on my honeymoon.
Yeah, that's great. Lot of Žižek in the McManus marriage.
It's true. Too much.
Matt and his wife met at a seminar conducted by Žižek. So there we go. So it's very appropriate.
Can I also just say, one of the things that does offend me about this is if you're going to start by dissecting a piece of literature by somebody who had a tremendous historical impact, by characterizing them as falling below the standard of an undergraduate essay, you better make sure that your own fucking analysis of that text is really, really, really good. And the fact that apparently you can't put together an argument that consists of 2 sentences does not speak well to that. Really does not at all.
Yeah, I mean, literally, he's saying the first sentence is an axiom, and he's ignoring the second sentence, which at the very least illustrates the meaning of the first sentence, even if you don't read it as an argument for it, and which completely invalidates this thing about how they don't realize that there's hierarchy before capitalism. And that's what I was going to say. It's what offends me most about this is all these people watched, right? All these people were charged to watch this thing. And not only could he not be bothered to read anything by the person he's debating, that would have been too much. Or I think, given some of the things he expresses surprise about in this debate, I don't know that he would watch very many YouTube videos. I don't think, you think at the very least, before you did this event, you might put in a solid weekend of watching Žižek on YouTube. Even if you weren't going to read any of the books or essays, he didn't do that. So all he's going to do is read one 40-page pamphlet, not by Žižek. What really offends me about this is the fact that he couldn't even be bothered to read that carefully. All he's reading is the Communist Manifesto, which is. So let's put it, 0 books wouldn't publish the Communist Manifesto. It'd be too short for them.
Doug Lane would be not Marxist enough.
Well, that too, but that's nothing about value form theory in there. But yeah, that's you're reading this 40-page thing. That's all you're doing to prepare, and you can't even bother reading it carefully. I mean, this just seems like a really lazy skim.
And what frustrates me about it also is that he actually readily acknowledges in the first chapter that in many senses, not just capitalism, but liberal bourgeois society is in many cases far freer than what came before. And he even celebrates that fact. I mean, this sentence here, the bourgeoisie, wherever it has gotten the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his, quote, natural superiors, and has left no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, that callous caste payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, the chivalrous enthusiasm, the Philistine sentimentalism in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value. In the place of numberless indefeasible chartered freedoms, has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade. And then he goes on to criticize it. But he's taking this very nuanced approach to the collapse of the old society and its replacement with a new kind of freedom that is genuinely more free than what came before, but of course is still extremely problematic in other respects.
Yeah,
right?
no, that's not. Yeah. I was just going to say.
Forgive me for my drama, right? I was going back to art school for a second.
No, I was just going to say that's exactly right. And that passage that you read, Matt, like you would need to read. You need to read that passage with nuance to be able to differentiate when he's celebrating, the rise of the bourgeoisie, and also, any close reading, like pitilessly tore asunder, right? Like you need to read this carefully in order to differentiate between, talk about separating the wheat from the chaff. It just seems like everything is, again, like the lack of a close read.
Yeah, I mean, this chapter. Sorry,
yeah, for sure. I was just going to say, I mean, like in that passage Matt read, like they're at the very same moment celebrating and criticizing. That they're talking. Yes. It's dialectical.
Exactly.
They're talking about how at the very same time capitalism is doing away with all these things that we're much better off having swept into the dustbin of history, about feudalism. That it is expanding human freedom in important ways. But also that there is this like icy, horrible core to what it's replacing it with. And yeah, I mean, like it just, since at the very least, if you don't get that much, right, if you don't get that this is going to be a take on capitalism that isn't just capitalism good or capitalism bad, it's going to be a vision of history in which the move from capitalism, from feudalism to capitalism, is a important expansion, is a massively important piece of historical progress, but one that also brings its own horrors and also paves the way for and creates the possibility of itself being superseded by something better.
Well, well, that's the dialectic again, that the bourgeoisie, they're their own gravediggers, right? I mean, that's another famous line, right? Because the bourgeoisie, I mean, it produces the proletariat and the very means of production and the very that will overthrow it. And so, you would need to have a basic grasp of the dialectic to understand the complexity to a lot of these points.
Yeah, JB, thank you for the super chat. Says every time they pause, everybody drink. Don't do that.
Yeah, I'd be aware of that. I don't
want to be responsible for anybody having to have their stomach pumped tonight. So. If you just want to watch the Peterson-Zizek debate, by the way, that's all over YouTube. If you're watching this, presumably it's because you want the commentary. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of pausing. So don't drink every time. Don't pause every time. Don't drink every time we pause. By the way, is it me or is JP's opening statement almost entirely incoherent? No comment on that. But let's go back to watch the rest of that statement.
Right. It is the case that hierarchical structures dispossess those people who are at the bottom, those creatures who are at the bottom, speaking, say, of animals, but those people who are at the bottom, and that is a fundamental existential problem. But the other thing that Marx didn't seem to take into account is that there are far more reasons that human beings struggle than their economic class struggle, even if you build the hierarchical idea into that, which is a more comprehensive way of thinking about it. Human beings struggle with themselves, with the malevolence that's inside themselves, with the evil that they're capable of doing, with the spiritual and psychological warfare that goes on within them. And we're also actually always at odds with nature. And this never seems to show up in Marx. And it doesn't show up in Marxism in general. It's as if nature doesn't exist. The primary conflict, as far as I'm concerned, or a primary.
Oh yeah.
Have another drink.
This is going to be, we can't be liable for people drinking every time we pause this because it's just.
I know, I'm not going to have that on my conscience. The deaths from alcohol poisoning tonight. Nature hardly exists for Marx. This is such a okay. Do one of you want to spell out some of the ways that nature exists in Marx, or for that matter, for God's sake, in Hegel, even before Marx, that Marx is building on?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, if you read some of the early Marx, it's extremely indebted to Hegel's philosophy of nature. I mean, where he goes down to like the atomic level to talk about elements. So
yeah, that's Marx's dissertation.
Yeah. So the idea, exactly. So the idea, it's absurd again.
Yeah, like his dissertation, I believe, if I'm remembering right, it's about like Democritus and
yes.
Theory of atoms, and also like even in Hegel and certainly in Marx, right? Like what does Marx think creates the basis for new forms of class society, coming about, one superseding the other. Is the progress in the forces of development of the forces of production. And so that's something that actually, I mean, even in Hegel, before Marx, there's already this idea that a big part of like the sort of expansion of freedom over history is freedom precisely from nature, and that's certainly that struggle against nature, and the way that sort of goes into the development of the productive forces of society, leading up to the point where capitalism is finally creating its own gravediggers, is like all over the place in Marx. I mean, this is just a weird, like,
yeah.
It really seems like he's just saying, like, I haven't found the word,
I'm trying to look through the manifesto where he talks about, the railroads and the steamship, like basically dominating nature. It's like, no, like nature is the raw material. There wouldn't be capitalism without nature. I don't understand.
Yeah, actually, in fact, if you read the Critique of the Gotha program, one of his criticisms of the Lassallean faction of the German socialist movement and Critique of the Gotha program, they say that labor creates all wealth, and there's actually this moment that's like a very sort of weird little, it's just a little moment of pedantic nitpicking from Marx and Critique of the Gotha program, where he says, hold on, that's not true. What about nature? Well, nature also contributes to creating it. So yeah, this is just as wrong as wrong could be. But Matt, what were you going to say?
Well, actually, I had a really good quote here that might actually answer some of our questions. It's from the 1844 manuscripts, where the young Marx, as it's called, it says, "Man is directly a natural being. As a natural being and as a living natural being, he is on the one hand," forgive the gendered language, by the way, 1844, "endowed with natural powers, vital powers. He is an active natural being. These forces exist in him as tendencies and abilities, as instincts. On the other hand, as a natural, corporeal, sensuous, objective being," there's a sentence for you, "he is a suffering, conditioned, and limited creature like animals and plants. That is to say, the objects of his instincts outside of him," nice dialectical twist there, "as objects independent of him, yet these objects are objects that he needs, essential objects indispensable to the manifestation and confirmation of his essential powers." And what's interesting about this passage, again, in the 1844 manuscripts, is how it echoes a lot of the very liberal theory that Jordan Peterson himself claims to be beholden to. Like this idea of human beings as a natural limited being who engage their essential powers to labor and improve their situation is something that could come straight out of the second treatise of government, right? This kind of Lockean conception of us as a possessive individualist who's limited in their physical capacities and needs to improve the world in order to improve those physical capacities. But what's really interesting about Marx and the way he differs from liberal thinkers is how he actually has a richer vision of human nature, precisely because he says, look, as we change the world around us, our human nature changes also. Not fundamentally, because we're still a biological, natural being, but in important ways. And it's really tricky to kind of keep up with how this cycles along, which is one of the reasons I'm going to be spending the rest of my life writing about these kinds of transitions in very complex and nuanced ways. So this idea that Marx doesn't have a theory of human nature is just bullshit, right? It's a very complicated theory of human nature. A lot of it actually echoes what Peterson himself was going to say about, the importance of liberal theory and labor and all that kind of stuff. But it has this strong historical element to it also that I think really enriches our understanding of the subject matter.
Yeah, I think the passage that you found, Matt, is is even better. This was the one I was thinking of from the manifesto. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? I mean, now that's literally nature, is aside from, a theory of human nature, but
it's also a cool sentence, right? Slumbered in the lap of something.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a very, again, this is so incredibly lazy, especially because he starts out by saying, Marx and Engels never considered the possibility that they might be wrong about anything. And presumably, I mean, that the man could have wandered down the hall at the University of Toronto, where he teaches, and found people who knew something about what Marx thought. And
the Appanage wasn't that far away.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, that would have been amazing. Oh God, I'd love to have seen that conversation. But yeah,
you and I both.
And said, "Hey, as I read Marx, he doesn't seem to have anything to say about nature. Is that right? Am I missing something?"
Right.
Conflict that human beings engage in is this struggle for life in a cruel and harsh natural world, and it's as if that doesn't exist in the Marxist domain. If human beings have a problem, it's because there's a class struggle that's essentially economic. It's like, no, human beings have problems because we come into life starving and lonesome. And we have to solve that problem continually. And we make our social arrangements, at least in part, to ameliorate that, as well as to, well, upon occasion, exacerbate it. And so there's also very little understanding in the Communist Manifesto that any of the, say, hierarchical organizations that human beings have put together might have a positive element. And that's an absolute catastrophe, because hierarchical structures are actually necessary to solve complicated social problems. We have to organize ourselves in some manner, and you have to give the devil his due. And so it is the case that hierarchies dispossess people, and that's a big problem. That's the fundamental problem of inequality.
Marx didn't know that we need to organize ourselves in some manner.
Hierarchies happen to be a very efficient way of distributing resources, and it's finally the case that human hierarchies are not fundamentally predicated on power. And I would say the biological, anthropological data on that are crystal clear. You don't rise to a position of authority that's reliable in a human society primarily by exploiting other people. It's a very unstable means of obtaining power. So that's a problem. Well, the people that laugh might do it that way. Okay, now another
it's been really unproductive for Amazon to exploit their workers.
You can think about history as a binary class struggle with clear divisions between, say, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And that's actually a problem, because it's not so easy to make a firm division between who's exploiter and who's exploitee.
Message just hacked us for a second.
Because
what was that?
Bezos just hacked us for a second.
Yeah, which by the way, certainly good that that Marx didn't know anything about the idea of social strata in between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. That's not like an idea that ever occurred to him. That there could be anything intermediate there.
If only there was the term like lumpen. I mean, unfortunately, that didn't exist in German at the time.
Yeah, like lumpen, like petty bourgeoisie.
Yeah.
No, it's that he didn't write anything about peasants. I mean, so much of and so much of Marx's writings, especially in the years after this, like the 18th Brumaire, are all about doing this like complicated class analysis, which again can agree with it or disagree with it, but like to even have that conversation, you know, you do need to start by like having some idea that it exists.
It's not obvious, like in the case of small shareholders, let's say, whether or not they happen to be part of the oppressed or part of the oppressor. This actually turned out to be a big problem in the Russian Revolution. And by big problem, I mean tremendously big problem. Because it turned out that you could fragment people into multiple identities, and that's a fairly easy thing to do.
Identities.
And you could usually find some axis along which they were part of the oppressor class. It might have been a consequence of their education, or it might have been a consequence of the wealth that they strived to accumulate during their life, or it might have been a consequence of the fact that they had parents or grandparents who were educated or rich, or that they were a member of the priesthood, or that they were socialists, or anyways, the listing of how it was possible for you to be bourgeois.
I mean, this is purely a Rawlsian joke, but it is. I am happy to see that he's slowly starting to discover the concept of moral arbitrariness.
Sure.
Immensely, and that was one of the reasons that the Red Terror claimed all the victims that it claimed. And so that was a huge problem. It was probably most exemplified by the demolition of the kulaks, who were basically peasant farmers, although effective ones in the Soviet Union, who had managed to raise themselves out of serfdom over a period of about 40 years and to gather some degree of material security about them. And about 1.8 million of them were exiled. About 400,000 were killed, and the net consequence of that removal of their private property because of their bourgeois status was arguably the death of 6 million Ukrainians in the famines of the 1930s. And so the binary class struggle idea, that was a bad idea. That was a very, very bad idea. It's also bad in this way, and this is a real sleight of hand that Marx pulls off, is you have a binary class division, proletariat and bourgeoisie, and you have an implicit idea that all of the good is on the side of the proletariat and all of the evil is on the side of the bourgeoisie. And that's classic group identity thinking. You know, it's one of the reasons I don't like identity politics, is because once you divide people into groups and pit them against one another, it's very easy to assume that all the evil in the world can be attributed to one group.
Okay, we got to pause it for a second. This is like this. I'm not even gonna, try to be. I'm going to try to be fair here, but I think that I think this actually is an important moment in the debate, because you see where Peterson has already taken Marx and Engels' argument and has repackaged it as primarily a moral argument. And that's not to say that there isn't any. Of course, there's morality embedded in the Communist Manifesto, but the idea that like he's taken proletariat and bourgeoisie and has equated that with, as though Marx and Engels are saying, bourgeoisie irredeemably evil, proletariat inherently good. And so he's already, he likes Nietzsche. So let's say for some reason, although at the same time he wants to, promote Judeo-Christian values. But
yeah, I've never understood that, like, because whatever you think of, like, there's lots of disagreement among Nietzsche scholars about how to read different things that Nietzsche says. But I think one thing everybody's pretty clear on is Nietzsche not a fan of the Judeo-Christian values.
He's got to go back and reread the Genealogy of Morals. But already a transvaluation has happened where now he's able to sort of make the target more easily attackable in his sort of cultural, one of his cultural complaints, sort of.
No, for sure. I mean, you notice that he you were joking about this earlier, but then he literally did it. He snuck in like identity. It's like, oh, there are different ways to, different, identities that you can apply to people, which again, it's also just incoherent because you can't like have it both ways. Either Marx and Engels are just economic determinists, which, as we've discussed, would be like a not crazy accusation if all you've read is the Communist Manifesto. But like either they're just pure economic reductionists or they're peddling some sort of early form of identity politics, but you certainly can't have it both ways.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point.
Yeah, and I would actually like to build on an argument Ben made in an article of his in Jacobin some time ago, where it talks about why it is that if you're concerned about people with an excess of power, you should actually support a kind of democratic socialism, since, of course, the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a very small group under capitalism is very much consonant with the possibility of those people abusing that power. And here I don't even think he understands Solzhenitsyn very well, because if you read the Gulag Archipelago closely, there's a reason why in his early youth he was really attracted to certain radical ideas, because he recognized the problems with the Tsarist society that existed before. He was deeply anxious about the kind of emergent bourgeois order, which was predicated on tremendous exploitation and led to the First World War. But, you know, of course, then we had the Bolsheviks and the terror and Stalin, and he said, this goes to show you that everything can go wrong if you get bad people in charge. And I think that's absolutely true when it comes to the Soviet example. But it's also very true when it comes to various capitalist societies that have been culminated by tremendously flawed individuals who seem to think that the rest of us just exist for them to use as a means to their ends. And this is why, drawing up on Ben, I would say that if you're concerned about power and its excesses, you should be deeply concerned about capitalism and really want a democratic socialist society where power is diffracted in a very fundamental way.
No, exactly. I mean, just to really so it doesn't get too abstract. I mean, just to be really clear about the point, because I think it's a very simple and intuitive one. The more you think that that the more cynical you are about human nature, the more you worry that given enough power over another person, that one person given enough power over another is going to treat that other person, like a, sadistic little boy might treat a spider trapped in a jar. That gives you a reason not to want to have the kind of imbalance of power that exists under capitalism, between, Jeff Bezos and the workers at those warehouses, or, between, Harvey Weinstein and everybody who worked for him. And so I think that's I think that's there's this I don't know, that's always seemed obvious to that's always seemed obvious to me that this sort of move from cynicism about human nature to pro-capitalism always seemed completely backwards. That that sure, I mean, I don't know, maybe it would be okay to have some people have the power that capitalists have over workers if you didn't think anybody was going to abuse it, or at least not nearly as bad.
Yeah. I also wanted to kind of speak to Russ's point about this really fucked up way that a lot of so-called cultural Christians or defenders of Western Christendom invoke Nietzsche to critique democratic socialists and Marxists. Because as Russell pointed out, Nietzsche was convinced that democratic socialism and liberalism and pretty much all egalitarian doctrines were the kind of bastard progeny of Christianity without God, right? And he makes this extremely express in a huge number of places. I'm writing about this right now for my new book on postmodernity, but in The Well to Power, he says, let there be no doubt about it. The key of culture is not to be found in this way. And in the praxis, we still have the forgeries of history in favor of the good man and the socialistic ideal, which he calls the residue of Christianity and Rousseau in the de-Christianized world. I mean, it's not like he's being shy about it, right? He's saying that socialism is just a continuation of the Christian ethic in a different way. And none of the people who kind of criticize socialism in the vein of Nietzsche, but also claim to care about Christianity, really seem to take this point on board. And frankly, it just pisses me off. So I really wanted to emphasize that point.
Yeah. Oh man, I don't think I watched whatever episode or segment he might have said this in, but it's a very Michael line. If Solzhenitsyn were alive today, he'd be on Joe Rogan talking about how Pussy Riot is a problem.
Yeah.
All right.
But good to the other. And that, well, and that's naive. That's naive beyond comprehension, because it's absolutely foolish to make the presumption that you can identify someone's moral worth with their economic standing. So, and that actually turned out to be a real.
Okay, sorry. I just realized I meant to say this and I forgot to, but I like it because he just explicitly said what Russ was accusing him of saying, that that he's somehow reading Marx and Engels as identifying people's moral worth with their economic standing, which is total nonsense in every way. I mean, he doesn't one thing that Marx and Engels are not interested in certainly not in the main lines of their work, maybe in the occasional footnote or jab at somebody in a letter, right? But one thing that they are not interested in is evaluating the moral worth of individuals.
Yeah.
That's just totally contrary. A focus on that is just totally contrary to the whole point. And in fact, not only do they not say in the Communist Manifesto that everybody who's a worker is good and everybody who's a capitalist is bad, they explicitly say in the Communist Manifesto that there's a section of the bourgeoisie that'll come over and side with the proletariat.
Yes.
Because
the
one of the authors of the Communist Manifesto.
Yeah. Well, because, and they also say this, because the proletariat recruits from other strata of society, because it's capitalist society is so or your social position or social standing in capitalism under capitalist society is so unstable that it constantly recruits people from the bourgeoisie because they've fallen into the proletariat.
Exactly.
Problem as well, because Marx also came up with this idea, which is a crazy idea as far as I can tell, that's a technical term, crazy idea, of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And that's the next idea that I really stumbled across. It was like, okay, so what's the problem? Well, the problem is the capitalists own everything. They own all the means of production, and they're oppressing everyone. That would be all the workers. And there's going to be a race to the bottom of wages for the workers as the capitalists strive to extract more and more value from the labor of the proletariat by competing with other capitalists to drive wages downward, which, by the way, didn't happen, partly because wage earners can become scarce, and that actually drives the market value upward. But the fact that you assume a priori that all the evil can be attributed to the capitalists and all the good, the bourgeoisie, and all the good could be attributed to the proletariat meant that you could hypothesize that a dictatorship of the proletariat could come about. And that was the first stage in the communist revolution. And remember, this is a call for revolution, and not just revolution, but bloody, violent revolution, and the overthrowing of all existent social structures.
Marx and Engels don't specify how much bloodshed they anticipate in revolutions in the Communist Manifesto, but to be really clear about this, the Communist Manifesto was written in 1848, as coinciding, with the with rumblings of revolutionary wave that was was in fact going to wash over Europe.
The Spring of Nations.
Yeah, exactly. And that, well, it was a spring of nations because of all these nationalist movements that were, in certain cases, depending on local context, going up against empires and or in other cases, Germany, complicated arrangements where they were trying to form unified nation states. But the point is that all of those revolutions in 1848 were against crowned heads of state.
Yes.
All of these countries that these revolutions were in were ruled by kings or emperors who did not allow for any sort of democratic mechanisms. So yeah, they were in, bloody is I think a little bit of unnecessary editorializing, but sure. They thought that armed revolution, was the only way to confront, to bring down such forces. And by the way, they were very aware that the immediately oncoming stage of revolution in many of these countries was going to be bourgeois democratic revolution before there could be, further move to socialism, which they explicitly say. The last chapter of the Communist Manifesto is about alliances with other political forces. But also, this is if you read their later writings, There's a speech that that Marx gave to the First International, the La Liberté speech in 1872, and there are various other places and letters and other, where they say this again, very explicitly. Their position was, look, in European countries that are ruled by kings and emperors, obviously the only mechanism the working class has is armed revolt, but when, as in England, not in 1848, but later on, while they're still alive, working class men at least are given the vote, then that creates the possibility for a different path to power, which they explicitly say on several occasions that they have that you could have a socialist party, democratically take power. Now they also express the concern that if that happened, the capitalist class would respond the way that the slave owners in the South responded to the election of Abraham Lincoln, and then that would have to be suppressed. But this idea that like the only sort of method of transition to socialism that Marx and Engels were willing to contemplate was blood in the streets is just a obviously the concern about the Lincoln analogy was well placed. I mean, that there are multiple examples in the 20th century of exactly that happening, but like the idea that they had some sort of like a priori commitment, it's bloodshed or nothing, is just wrong. I mean, like they were willing to work with whatever was available, and they their position basically was, look, social change will involve as much or as little violence as the guardians of the existing society, are dictate, right? That like in their defense of it, if they let us peacefully and democratically do away with capitalism, great. If they don't, then they don't, but this is ultimately their call.
Yeah, and I want to actually build upon that by saying that there are a lot of criticisms that you can make of revolutionary movements and their excesses, some of which I would agree with. But it's worth noting that there's a tremendous amount of violence, both in counter-revolutionary movements and even in the intellectual defenses of them. Like you can go back to Joseph de Maistre commenting on the French Revolution and the excesses of the terror, and you'll sit there and be kind of nodding along, being like, yeah, probably shouldn't be guillotining that many people. But then he'll just have this moment where he says, 4 million Frenchmen will have to die in order to pay for one king. And you think, sounds a bit genocidal to me, doesn't it? And not coincidentally, that's exactly what happened in the case of many of these counter-revolutionary movements, where they imposed brutal regimes by force on nascent democratic movements that cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. And it's something that's not really acknowledged a great deal in the reactionary literature, nor is it acknowledged that a lot of the things that these counter-revolutionaries argued for when they were talking about the excesses of revolution are now considered so antiquated that no one could possibly defend them. I mean, are you going to find any conservative today denigrating democratic society as the swinish multitude like Edmund Burke did? Probably not, if they fucking want to have any kind of popularity, right?
Well, I was just going to say, like, people should really take shots whenever de Maistre gets mentioned, because that's more entertaining than Burke, I think, actually.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, like 4 million is a big number. Right?
It's a big number.
Yeah. Well, and of course, it's not even just that like counter-revolutionary writers were writing that, were saying that. I mean, like, one of the most shocking moments in, if you listen to like the French Revolution season of Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast, that he kind of mentions in passing, is that the White Terror in Poland, when there was an attempt at a Jacobin style revolution there in the 1790s, killed more people than the entirety of Robespierre's reign of terror in France, which is not to make a judgment one way or the other about any of it. That's a separate question, but but like it is amazing how somehow or another the collective historical memory only seems to record violence by revolutionaries.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyways, the problem with that, you see, is that because all the evil isn't divided so easily up into oppressor and oppressed, that when you do establish a dictator of the proletariat, to the degree that you can do that, which you actually can't because it's technically impossible and an absurd thing to consider to begin with, not least because of the problem of centralization. I mean, you have to hypothesize that you can take away all the property of the capitalists, you can replace the capitalist class with a minority of proletariats. How they're going to be chosen isn't exactly clear in the Communist Manifesto, but none of the people who are from the proletariat class are going to be corrupted by that sudden access to power because they're, well, by definition, good. So then you have the good people who are running the world, and you also have them centralized so that they can make decisions that are insanely complicated to make, in fact, impossibly complicated to make. And so that's a failure conceptually on both dimensions, because first of all the proletariat aren't going to be good, and when you put people in the same position as the evil capitalists, especially if you believe that social pressure is one of the determining factors of human character, which the Marxists certainly believe, then why wouldn't you assume that the proletariat would immediately become as or more corrupt than the capitalists, which is, of course, I would say exactly what happened every time this experiment was run. And then the next problem is, well, what makes you think that you can take some system as complicated as like capitalist free market society and centralize that and put decision-making power in the hands of a few people, the mechanisms without specifying the mechanisms by which you're going to choose them? Like, what makes you think they're going to have the wisdom or the ability to do what the capitalists were doing, unless you assume, as Marx did, that all of the evil was with the capitalists and all the good was with the proletariats, and that nothing that capitalists did constituted valid labor, which is another thing that Marx assumed, which is palpably absurd.
All right. Take your shot. So
yeah, there's a lot of it. You're not kidding. Yeah.
I mean, okay. We've already dealt with the like bizarre falsehood that Marx thought all of the evil was like concerned with individual moral character at all, thought that all the evil moral character was on one side or another, even thought that all the bad politics was on one side or another. But also he's talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat, which, by the way, if I'm not mistaken, is a phrase that's not even used in the Communist Manifesto. He's just heard that elsewhere. In the Communist Manifesto, there are phrases about like taking hold of the machinery of the state, winning the battle of democracy. That's a phrase they use, and taking state power in some way, but they don't actually use that phrase. They use that phrase in remarkably few places, actually, and it's not always entirely clear. I mean, exegetically, how it fits in with the other thoughts that they expressed about how transition to socialism could work. But the one thing that they do, like, if you are interested in in what they mean by the dictatorship of the proletariat, well, they actually tell you in very concrete terms, it's not speculative, like what that would look like. They say explicitly what it would look like. They say it would look like the Paris Commune in 1871. And if you look at the Paris Commune, if you spend a second afternoon reading Marx, and you read his book Civil War on France, which is about the size of the Communist Manifesto, where he describes the Paris Commune, the features that he likes about the Paris Commune are things like every state official is paid no more than the average wage of a skilled worker. Every state official is elected and subject to recall by their constituents at any time and for any reason. Stuff like this, and of course, abandoned factories, being turned over to workers. It's what the vision is, a radically democratic vision, right? What it means to call it a dictatorship is, there's an analogy there to dictatorships in the Roman Republic, that you're exerting your will in some like unusual way for a temporary period, but clearly, and I'm not saying that the concept is well fleshed out in Marx and Engels. It's absolutely not. It's we have little fragments here and there, where we can kind of reconstruct it from. But those fragments are pretty clear that like what they mean by dictatorship of the proletariat, in other words, of the entire working class, is very different from the dictatorship of a single party or even a single person.
Yeah. And I mean, Ben, your point, they don't use the term, but even if in the manifesto, but even if they did, what Peterson is doing here is presuming the horizon of his thinking is so embedded within the capitalist mode of production that he doesn't either he doesn't realize, or it's totally fine to disagree with Marx and Engels that
right.
Dictatorship of the proletariat were to come along, then I'm skeptical that we would have a classless society. But to say that they don't engage this, I mean, it's really toward the end of the very end of the second part, proletarians and communists, right? When in the course of development, class distinctions have disappeared, and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation, not these select few managers that he is saying here, as though we were under the capitalist model still. When this happens, the public power will lose its political character. Political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for opposing another. If the proletariat, during its contest with the bourgeoisie, is compelled by the force of circumstances, blah, 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 but he says it'll sweep away by force the old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonisms and of classes generally, and will thereby have abolished its own supremacy as a class. Now, you could disagree whether or not that will actually happen, but that is Marx and Engels' vision there, which he completely ignores.
I'd like to put it a slightly different way, just because I think this is a good point to talk a little bit about the kind of rhetoric of reaction that you see Peterson deploying here, because the kind of argument that he's making that we just don't know if we enact some kind of change that it'll be better than what we have before, and the implication is usually that it'll be worse, although that's not always explicitly stated, is a really common one that a lot of conservatives will make, right? This idea that we either jeopardize ourselves by trying to engage in these chains, or there's going to be this perverse counter reaction where what we try to produce is actually going to produce the opposite of what we intend. And I think that there's a grain of truth to these kind of rhetorical statements, right? We definitely shouldn't be leaping into change without thinking about it. And obviously some of what we do is going to have an unintended effect, right? Especially the bigger the change that we want to enact, the bigger the ripple effects will be, both on our own polity and around the globe. But one of the things that's never really accounted for in this is, of course, that if your argument is that society is too complex for us to really be sure that any change that we enact is going to be beneficial, then it's also too complex to say that any change that we enact won't necessarily be beneficial, because we can't be sure that the society as it exists right now is the best that we can possibly do, right? And one of the things that I also find really problematic about this is usually the implication is, well, if we try to enact some kind of change, it'll have unintended consequences, and those will be bad. My counterexample to that is, well, there might be unintended consequences that are actually really beneficial, right? For instance, if you help to elevate people out of a level of economic immiseration, make them reasonably well off, it's quite likely, and it's been proven many times, that crime will fall in many countries, since, lo and behold, poor people tend to commit more crimes than people who are reasonably well off. That wasn't the intention of people who tried to make poor people better off, more often than not. It was an unintended consequence. It just happened to be beneficial. And we wouldn't have got there unless there were some people who actually decided to take the necessary steps to try to alleviate things like poverty in the first place, right? So these kind of rhetorical strategies can seem like they have a kind of pseudo-profundity to them. We just don't know. Society's too complex. It's too big, too complicated to them. Until you actually undertake an analysis of the argumentative logic underpinning them, and you realize there's just not really much there, right? It's about a kind of fear-mongering and the generation of a feeling of uncertainty to keep you impotent when it comes to trying to agitate for things like political reform.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, if like the unintended consequences of doing absolutely nothing could be disastrous, and historically very often are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can sit here and do nothing about the environment for 1,000,000 years, and maybe we'll be avoiding some negative unintended consequences in that respect. But it's also quite possible that the planet might just wind up destroying itself. So.
because people who are, like maybe if you're a dissolute aristocrat from 1830 or earlier, and you run a feudal estate and all you do is spend your time gambling and chasing prostitutes, well, then your labor value is zero. But if you're running a business,
That was funny.
a
I'll
successful
give him that.
business, first of all, you're a bloody fool to exploit your workers, because even if you're greedy as sin, because you're not going to extract the maximum amount of labor out of them by doing that. And the notion.
Just real quick, what does Jordan Peterson think Marxists mean by exploiting workers?
It's a good question. I mean, I don't think he doesn't know them. I mean, it's not in the manifesto, at least explicitly. So I don't think he knows he's familiar with the concept of surplus value, but.
Yeah, because the way which is weird that it's not in the Communist Manifesto, but dictatorship of the proletariat isn't in there, exploitation isn't in there, but he sort of vaguely heard these are things that Marxists believe. He certainly hasn't asked any what they mean by it. And so as far as I can tell, what he means by exploiting workers is I don't know, being really harsh or really unfair, or really leaving people almost nothing for themselves. But none of those things have anything to do, right, with what Marxists mean by exploiting workers. And, sometimes people take it too far and say it's just a technical economic concept. There's no normative component. Obviously, there's a normative component, or you wouldn't call it exploitation. But there is a very so there's there's normative judgment that's certainly built into calling it that. But the concept itself is just what's being described is just the difference between the value that's produced by workers and what they get to keep, right? That's right. It.
Yeah. I mean, if you really wanted to know about exploitation, you could have just gone to talk to one of the TAs at U of T. I mean, they would have had plenty to tell them about that, right? Let me tell you about my life and what's been going on as your research assistant, and then that might help explain it and explicate.
Yeah. And also, of course, Marxists absolutely do not have to say that that nobody who owns a business does any sort of labor. Of course, some do, some don't, right? There are people who inherit businesses and then, they just hire people to deal with the annoyance, management of it. And that's that. But there are people who do, but that's not the point, right? I mean, you could just, the fact that some owners, especially in smaller businesses, do obviously have to work, at the business themselves, is just a separate question from whether, workers are putting in, work and, creating more labor, more value than what they get back in wages, which is all you need for the charge of exploitation.
That you're adding no productive value as a manager rather than a capitalist it's absolutely absurd. All it does.
Most managers are not capitalists. Most managers are people hired by capitalists.
Indicate that you either know nothing whatsoever about how an actual business works, or you refuse to know anything about how an actual business works.
You actually shit over Bernie Sanders about this a few weeks ago. Did you see that?
No, I did not.
Oh, he tweeted out when Bernie Sanders was fight for 15, run a business, Bernie, or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. There you go. Of course, the exactly parallel reply, I think, would sting a bit more, which is, forget putting yourself in the shoes of somebody who's running a business. Go try to survive on less than $15 an hour, Jordan.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right. But what I think is interesting about this is he doesn't really seem to understand how it is that Marx's comments about exploitation actually flow from a lot of the liberal principles he holds dear, particularly about being entitled to payment or compensation for the labor that you put into something. And this is a point that was actually made by a U of T professor, C.B. McPherson, in his book, The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism, which is kind of a Marxist take on Locke and all the others, where he says, look, the person who coined a labor theory of entitlement to property was it Marx?
Locke.
It was Locke, right? Locke came
Yeah.
up with this idea that you work for something, you put your labor in it, it's yours. But then he says, they ran into this problem, which is that the workers are the ones who actually do put their labor into things and produce them. And so why doesn't everything that they produce belong to them, but rather belongs to your boss, right? And McPherson points out that what ended up happening is the capitalist state was created, which actually allowed you to live off the alienated labor of other people. So you could work for me and you could produce something, but then I get to keep what you make and I get to benefit from the value that's within it. And it's a really very simple idea that flows right out of Lockean proto-economics, proto-modern economics, right? And one of the things that Marx points out in Capital is that, look, if you actually really hold to this principle that if you work for something and invest your labor in it, it's yours, then you actually have to be anti-capitalist, right? Since capitalism is about living off the alienated labor of others. Now, I think, his actual account of exploitation is more complicated than that, but the kind of moral force of this objection is really strong. And that's why people like F.A. Hayek in the future, for instance, will tell other conservative liberals, stop talking about why it is that if you work hard, you should get something from that, because you're just playing right into the hands of all the Marxists when you do that, right? If capitalists want to be lazy and sit on their ass all day, they should still be allowed to do so and remain rich. Because if we say that they have to work, we're going to offer too many concessions to socialist morality, right?
Yeah. And that is always interesting, because like reactionaries cannot wean themselves off of appeals to, hard work, look at these people who worked so hard to build up this business, etc. But of course, taken seriously, if you think that people are entitled to things because of hard work, then who's done more work to build up Amazon? Jeff Bezos, or the people peeing in bottles and literally doing backbreaking labor at his warehouses.
Yeah, no kidding. Huh?
Yeah.
That's also a big problem. So then the next problem is the criticism of profit. It's like, well, what's wrong with profit exactly? What's the problem with profit? Well, the idea from the Marxist perspective was that profit was theft. But profit, can be theft because crooked people can run companies. And so sometimes profit is theft, but that certainly doesn't mean that it's always theft. What it means, in part at least, if the capitalist is adding value to the corporation, then there's some utility and some fairness in him or her extracting the value of their abstract labor, their thought, their abstract abilities, their ability to manage the company, and to engage in proper competition and product development and efficiency and the proper treatment of the workers and all of that. And then if they can create a profit, well, then they have a little bit of security for times that aren't so good. And that seems absolutely bloody necessary as far as I'm concerned. And then the next thing is, well, how can you grow if you don't have a profit? And if you have a
Critique of the Gotha program would have answered a lot of these questions for him.
Also a 40-page book.
Also a 40-page book. It would not have taken long to read. He could have done that manifesto of the Civil War in France and had some time left over in his weekend. But in Critique of the Gotha program, Marx very explicitly says that that under communism, contra what the Lassalleans thought, or at least this Lassallean's slogans about this suggested, workers wouldn't be getting back the full value of their labor because, of course, you need to set some aside for several purposes that he lists there, including further industrial production, like repairing old machines, building new ones. Those are along with, of course, things like schools and hospitals, and he says the equivalent of poor aid, of aid for the poor, that upkeep for those who are unable to work, that like you have to have deductions for all these things before you return to individual workers, their portion of what's created. So yeah, Marx of course agrees with what he says here and says that in this very, very accessible, very short pamphlet. And the objection isn't, it's not that every single, well, just for the sake of simplicity, let's just use like the language of money, that every single dime created by workers, goes, immediately goes back to what they have available for consumption. It's not being extracted by a class of capitalists with the workers themselves having no say over what happens to it.
An enterprise that's valuable and worthwhile, and some enterprises are valuable and worthwhile, then it seems to me that a little bit of profit to help you grow seems to be the right approach. And so, and then the other issue with profit, and you know this if you've ever run a business, is it's really useful constraint. Like it's not enough to have a good idea. It's not enough to have a good idea and a sales and marketing plan, and then to implement that and all of that. That's bloody difficult. Like it's not easy to have a good idea. And it's not easy to come up with a good sales and marketing plan. And it's not easy to find customers and satisfy them. And so if you allow profit to constitute a limitation on what it is that you might reasonably attempt, it provides a good constraint on wasted labor. And so most of the things that I've done in my life, even psychologically, that were designed to help people's psychological health, I tried to run on a for-profit
I actually wanted
basis.
to make one quick comment about this. Yeah, because I think this is actually another good point to talk about a common rhetorical strategy that you'll see a lot of conservative defenders of capitalism and other kinds of hierarchy make, which is this emphasis on the smallness, right? And it reminds me of a PragerU video where they're defending capitalism against some common criticisms from the left, where they talk about a guy who runs a little flower shop, but big government gets in the way and overregulates and overtaxes him. So lo and behold, his little flower shop ends up dying, and we all don't get to benefit from a little bit more beauty in the world. It's really cute, right? And JP is making the same kind of arguments here, where it's like, if you want to set things up, you have a good idea, a little bit of profit, as he says, can help you go a long way. I don't know any Marxist who's really dedicated a great deal of their time to talking about the dangers of these kinds of small businesses, right? What is almost invariably discussed is precisely the kind of power dynamics that emerge when wealth concentrates in the hands of a number of gigantic monopolizing firms who are essentially able to edge out their competitors, both economically and sometimes using political mechanisms if they get enough clout to do that, right? And that's something that's not really engaged by this metaphor. But it's interesting because Peterson often shifts, in the way a lot of conservatives do, between these two different kind of rhetorical strategies. On the one hand, talking about smallness and coming across as a common sense man of the people who understands the little guy in a way that a lot of progressives don't, while on the other hand talking about huge abstract pseudo-profundities, like saying the world consists of ideas and beliefs in a more than metaphysical sense. And I think it's important to note that the relationship...
Actual quote.
It is actually a quote from Math and Meaning. And I think it's worth noting the association between the two is actually really very dialectical. Because on the one hand, when conservatives want to appeal to the little guy, they talk about things that are small, quaint, traditional, local, easy to understand. But then people point out that there are problems in getting in the way of the little guy. Then they deviate to the next rhetorical strategy, which is just things are too big, too complicated, and too massive for you to possibly understand, right? And it's really kind of a gimmick that I've seen people on the left sometimes do also, and we should try to avoid. But it's a powerful gimmick, and I wish more people would pay attention to it, because once you realize what it is, it really becomes a lot less convincing, and it even becomes a little bit mechanical, the way that it's employed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this, there's a lot of ambiguity in a small business. Like what's small, right? Like are we talking about people who are like basically self-employed, and or sort of kind of self-employed, but like
I mean, I have a Patreon. Am I a small business now?
Yeah, exactly. And or do we mean like somebody with like 50 employees, so they're like a small business, in the greater scheme of things, but they definitely have the same relationship, to like to the workers, that somebody in a much larger business would have, except maybe they have to squeeze them harder because they're so afraid of, going out of business.
Yeah.
It
it seems to me like that, like Matt's point about scale and smallness. I think a similar mistake is made, or maybe intentionally, by conservatives. Where was I going with this? Now I just had a brain fart. But especially in Peterson's critique of private property, or like the abolishment of private property, as though that means that we're going to go in and well, first of all, an apartment is not property, but we're going to start throwing petty bourgeois people out of their homes and make them live in communes, as though, Marx and Engels, go.
I might expropriate your bookcase because you got a lot of
right, exactly, yeah. Marx and Engels, they go out of their way specifically to say in the manifesto that by private property we mean the means of production. We don't. Right. But the scaremongering is, well, they're gonna take your car or your boat. We might take Jeff Bezos's 9 yachts, but we're not going to take, the flower shop owner's car. It's insane.
No, exactly. And actually, even, the places where Marx and Engels talk about a dictatorship, the proletariat transition to socialism, the suggestion actually seems to be that expropriating things is, like bringing more of the economy into the socialized sphere, is going to be a gradual process, over time. They have some criticisms of the Paris Commune, but they didn't nationalize every flower shop the day after the revolution. That's not one of them. So.
Like I always say, the little girl who wants to set up a lemonade stand, she'll be fine. The big fruit industry that helped to overthrow all kinds of democratically elected regimes in Latin America, they might be a little bit more in trouble.
Yeah, well, I should say, this isn't, this is a little bit off topic, but since we're talking about it, on these sorts of questions, all right, given the sort of socialism that we could have, and by the way, I think I've been doing a lot of defending Marx and Engels tonight, and in life in general, but I think one legitimate critique that I think actually Russ and I talked about the first time he was on the channel is that oftentimes they are a little vague, right? About how
definitely,
how they see socialism working, and fortunately there are later socialists who've come up with ways of filling in the details, and I point out David Schweikart's book After Capitalism is a personal favorite of mine. Alec Nove, the Economics of Feasible Socialism, is a book that's worth reading and thinking about along these lines.
Boskar's The Socialist Manifesto is my personal favorite.
Yeah, well, it's because it's funny that you mentioned him, because that is my other big news. Besides canceling comedians coming out in the last few days, we kind of had the informal offer a long time ago, but it's finally official now that Bhaskar and I and Mike Beggs, who's a Australian economist who writes for Jacobin, are co-writing a book that's basically a book-length version of the first chapter of the Socialist Manifesto. When he's sort of laying out, what that realistic kind of fully socialist society would look like, and dealing with these sorts of questions, right? Okay, do you have, there's the flower shop. If the flower shop has 5 full-time employees, that organizes a co-op, how does that work? How's funding going to work? That's, so we try to get into some of these then, although that book's not going to come out till optimistically late 2022. So, while you're waiting for that, read the Socialist Manifesto and read Schweikart. But
congratulations on both of those, about the canceling comedians and the Verso book, though.
Yeah, man, I'm super excited for that one.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm really excited to to be writing it, and yeah, it's like cancel comedian. It's like it's almost bizarre that it's finally out now, because it's such a long time coming, and it's like such a and such a weird thing to turned in the started writing that book at the end of 2019, and turned in the final copy at its July of last year, and it's. I don't know. It's especially strange because it's such a long time coming, and it's also a book that was written in this really intense period of kind of working through the many frustrations with the left that inspired me to write the thing in the first place. So in a lot of ways, it's a very weird thing, be sort of have this.
Yeah, and none of those issues got worse on the left since 2019, Ben. So that's
yeah. Well, people have heard me say this on the stream before, but it's kind of funny. You want to know how good my crystal ball is. There were points in early 2020 when I was working on. I was like, okay, as mad as I am about the counterproductive moralistic nonsense and all the ways the left is getting its own way, it's possible that by the time this book's not going to come out till 2021. By the time it comes out, it's possible that Bernie Sanders will be president, DSA, because Bernie Sanders is president, and they'll change the train of political struggle. And so DSA will have 1 million people in it. There'll be all this really good stuff going on in the real world, and a book about how the left is undermining itself and getting in its own way and screwing up is just going to seem weirdly irrelevant. And man, I did not need to worry about that.
no.
Yeah, no kidding. It's kind of hard to think back to when you were starting to write that book, and none of us had ever heard of this thing called COVID. Right? It's a different fucking world.
Yeah, no, that's right. That all everything fell apart in that way, literally as I was writing it, so I didn't sort of on purpose kind of didn't reference it until the end, because I was still working on it, when all that had started to happen. But yeah, it's a very a lot has changed, but none of the issues that drove that book to be written have been resolved, or even gotten better, or failed to get worse in the time since then. So yeah, but there's something about weirdly weird about writing something in the heat of that frustration, and then waiting for 10 months, and then finally people are going to start reading it, and you're finally going to sort of hear what they all think about it. But anyway, I'm excited that it's I'm excited that it's happening, that it's happened, and that that the people are reading it, and if nothing else, look. A lot of people were extremely mad at me for writing this book months ago when they didn't even know what I said in it. So, if nothing else, everybody has a chance now to find out whether their anger was justified. So,
Wait, Ben, you're saying that people prejudge things without actually analyzing them in online spaces? Would never fucking happen. Never fucking happen.
Yeah, and that you could have. That you could have these crazy rushes to judgment and to morally condemn things on the basis of a wisp of nothing, and that this could in turn become a problem for the left. That's coincidentally, you can read about that in Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, critique of the contemporary left. So I had the thought many times when people there were all the hundreds of people freaking out about the cover on when I posted the cover image on Twitter, that this was amazing free advertising for the book. It's well, clearly none of this is a problem, right?
Yeah.
So, anyway, all right. I am still bound and determined, if possible. It's after 11. I want to at least, for God's sake, we need to at least get through Peterson's opening statement. Maybe Slavoj's too.
Apart from the fact that I'm not averse to making a profit, partly so my enterprises can grow, but was also so that there were forms of stupidity that I couldn't engage in because I would be punished by the market enough to eradicate the enterprise. And so
Okay, and then so the next issue, this is a weird one. So Marx and Engels also assume that this dictatorship of the proletariat, which involves absurd centralization, the overwhelming probability of corruption, and impossible computation, as the proletariat now try to rationally compute the manner in which an entire market economy could run, which cannot be done because it's far too complicated for anybody to think through. The next theory is that somehow the proletariat dictatorship would become magically hyperproductive. And there's actually no theory at all about how that's going to happen. And so I had to infer the theory, and the theory seems to be that once you eradicate the bourgeoisie, because they're evil, and you get rid of their private property, and you eradicate the profit motive, then all of a sudden, magically, the small percentage of the proletariat who now run the society determine how they can make their productive enterprises productive enough so they become hyper-productive. Now, and they need to become hyper-productive for the last error to be logically coherent in relationship to the Marxist theory, which is that at some point the proletariat, the dictatorship of the proletariat, will become so hyper-productive that there'll be enough material goods for everyone across all dimensions. And when that happens,
he skipped the part about overproduction being a problem under capitalism.
In meaningful creative labor, which is what they had been alienated from in the capitalist horror show, and the utopia will be magically ushered in. But there's no indication about how that hyperproductivity is going to come about, and there's also no understanding that while that isn't the utopia that is going to suit everyone, because there are great differences between people, and some people are going to find what they want in love, and some are going to find it in social being, and some are going to find it in conflict and competition, and some are going to find it in creativity, as Marx pointed out. But the notion that will necessarily be the end goal for the utopian state is preposterous. And then there's the Dostoevskian observation too, which is one not to be taken lightly, which is, well, what sort of shallow conception of people do you have that makes you think that if you gave people enough bread and cake, in the Dostoevskian terms, and nothing to do with except to busy themselves with the continuity of the species, that they would also all of a sudden become peaceful and heavenly? Dostoevsky's idea was that, we were built for trouble. And if we were ever handed everything we needed on a silver platter, the first thing we would do is engage in some form of creative destruction, just so something unexpected could happen, just so we could have the adventure of our lives. And I think there's something to be said for that.
That's a halfway decent point, I think. I think Slavoj articulates it better later, but...
Yeah, and I wanted to say, actually, one of the books that he's most fond of, Dostoevsky's Demons or Devils, whichever way you want to translate it, is actually pretty funny as a kind of scathing satire of the Russian left at its time. And I will admit that when I read it, writing the Myth and Mayhem book, there were some parts that made me laugh, because I realized that if you took the worst elements of the left of the 19th century, it's not all that different from some of the people that Ben made fun of in his book. There's a lot of people there who are naming and shaming, not really doing all that much, have a lot of ideas about things, but think others should be responsible for implementing them. Anyway, we can go on.
Yeah, fair enough. Just to make sure I got your point though, Russ, what's the point that you were saying that you thought that Peterson was making well here, and that Žižek returns to later?
Well, I think the idea that that if you eliminate economic immiseration or want, that suddenly everyone is going to become peaceful. And I'm not saying that that's Marx and Engels' view, although I do have a critique at certain points of Marx and Engels' utopianism, but I think that so I do think that a sort of vulgar, I'm not using the term necessarily as it's typically used, but like vulgar Marxism, a very sort of economically reductionist one would make that argument, but it's not the argument that Marx and Engels are making. And so I just think Slavoj makes this argument better, more effectively about when he talks about in his opening statement, sort of critiquing the notion of happiness, which I don't know if Peterson, I can't remember if he's going to get to it toward the end of this, because we're nearing the end of his comments, but I think Slavoj has the more compelling, critique of the notion of happiness. So I thought that was a halfway decent point that Peterson was making here, even though I don't think it's attributable to Marx or Engels.
I would actually like to articulate it a somewhat different way, because I actually also think it's a powerful critique. And if you read Notes from the Underground or Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky's critique of those who think that we can't have a scientific society that adequately cares for all human needs, that's purely based on a hedonistic kind of logic, is pretty powerful satirically. Right? This idea that you just give people enough bread and cake and that's all that they have, they'll be happy, is a very shallow understanding of human nature. Right? And there's no doubt that at various points there are some progressives, particularly in the 19th century, who wrote like that. You can think of people in the utilitarian tradition, or vulgar utilitarian tradition. But one of the things that I think is actually notable is that there was another Russian author who I think put forward the best objection to this on Dostoevsky's own terms. And that was Leo Tolstoy in his book, The Kingdom of God is Within You. Because he says, look, people like Dostoevsky are talking about how life needs to be a struggle and there's always going to be imperfections in society that we have. People are sinful. And he says, I agree with all of that. But if you really wanted something to struggle for, and you felt that it needed to be a big struggle that really provided a sense of meaning to your life, wouldn't a just world and a better social order be exactly the kind of trick to solve that problem? And I think that he's absolutely right. And the kind of czarist reactionary politics that Dostoevsky ultimately ended up embracing, that supported things like tremendous aristocratic privilege, exploitation, in many ways seems like a far less meaningful and rich spiritually society than the kind of one that Tolstoy wants, which is framed by a deep demand for justice on the part of the least well-off, and the continual trials that are involved in establishing a society where the least among us actually are those that are cared for first and foremost.
Yeah, and I'd say, like, actually, this is stuff I talked about in that video I did for Zero. After the topic for this debate was announced, that certainly, all sources of human unhappiness are not solved by doing away with poverty and class antagonism and economic despotism in the workplace. In fact, some of them stay, right? I mean, obviously, heartbreak isn't going anywhere, disease, death, romantic disappointment.
Shitty boy bands will still exist in the democratic socialist future, right?
Yeah. Also, though, some new ones are actually going to be opened up, that there are going to be some new sources of unhappiness, because one of the,
No, I think that point you're making there about new sources of, I think that's exactly right. I think that, you can, I mean, I'm going to bring things down a little bit from Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and go to like a show like Mad Men, right? Even the richest people on that, they're entirely miserable. And that's right. And that's, they're not happy in any, sort of naive or sort of, traditional, colloquial sense of the term, but that doesn't, and that's not to say, the old say, money doesn't bring happiness. Okay. But if you eliminate the kinds of immiseration that we have under capitalism, I guess, like, my sort of optimistic, and this, I don't know, I would hope Slavoj would sort of appreciate this, but that people would, if we had a more egalitarian way of being miserable, or of finding your ways of self-sabotaging, which is a concept that the psychoanalytic concept of death drive that sort of Slavoj is going to, doesn't use the term death drive, but does talk about self-sabotage. So if we had a more, like, my idea would be, we would have a more egalitarian way of finding these new means of being unhappy, so that, like, we're not unhappy solely because, we're living from paycheck to paycheck.
Exactly. No, I think that's exactly right. And I mean, look, I think an aspiration for socialist society that has very deep roots in classical Marxism. I mean, you look at stuff like Marx's Fragment on Machines, from the Grundrisse is the idea that one of the benefits of socialism is supposed to be that we all have much more free time, because under capitalism, when there's new automation, there's just some people just lose their jobs and they're put into destitution, and everybody else works just as hard as they did before. Whereas if workers control the means of production, there's the possibility of handling automation differently. That basically everybody democratically votes themselves fewer hours, with no loss of standard of living, and of course Marx at his most utopian in Critique of the Gotha Program is talking about how he thinks in the lower stage of communism you're going to need various kinds of incentives for labor, that you have to pay people some people more than others essentially, because of the duration or intensity of their labor. But he says under the higher phase, when you have superabundance of material resources, and presumably at least putting together what he says in Critique of the Gotha Program with what he says in the Fragment on Machines to try to get a sense of what it means, you have such superabundance and also so much labor that used to be done by humans was automated away that what's left to be done by humans can just kind of get done by everybody pursuing their own interests, then that's the sort of maximum stage in that development. And look, whether or not you think we're going to get all the way to, that we're ever going to get all the way to the sort of utopian heights of, Marx's second stage of communism, Critique of the Gotha Program, certainly, at least, I'd hope that, I certainly am enough of a classical Marxist to think that under socialism, we could all have much more leisure time, and that's part of the advantage of transition to socialism. But look, if we all have our material needs met, and we all have much more leisure time, then that one of the advantages of that is that it gives everybody a chance to pursue whatever's most meaningful to them. So you finally write that novel. You try to see if you can play like Hendrix. You try to write some philosophical meditations. You try to whatever, right? Like fill in the blank, in whatever's way is most meaningful to you, that people can pursue projects of their own choosing rather than those that are chosen from them. But look, that doesn't mean they'll be happy. In fact, that opens up a lot of new sources of unhappiness, because at least if you're financially insecure, you have to work all the time, and so you don't have time to write that novel. You never have to find out that you're a shitty novelist and that you don't actually have the potential to write like Tolstoy, whereas like finding that out about yourself can be absolutely devastating.
Funny story about that. Terry Eagleton wrote that near the end of his life. Marx apparently got a little bit lazy when it came to the writing of Volume 2 and Volume 3 of Das Kapital, because he was really into Shakespeare. And he actually contemplated writing a book on Shakespeare and tried to write poetry in the vein of Shakespeare. And I read a little bit of it. It's not very good. So even Marx was probably near the end of his life coming to the realization that even a man as bright and as insightful as him has his limitations when it comes to the aesthetic virtues.
Yeah, his discussions of literature are good though, but yeah, his writing, yeah.
Fair enough. So yeah, I mean, I expect there to be a lot of that, and like you said, I mean, you just look at our existing society. Lots of people are economically secure but miserable for all sorts of reasons, and maybe different reasons. But that's the point. It's not that unhappiness, goes away. It's just that it's you're not unhappy because you're unfree. You're not unhappy because you're you're not unhappy because you're because you're financially anxious, or or you're worried that you're not going to be able to raise enough money on GoFundMe to pay for your insulin. You can be unhappy for more interesting reasons, and that itself strikes me as something to aspire to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Error, let's say, although by no means the last, was this is one of the strangest parts of the Communist Manifesto, is Marx admits, and Engels admit
He admits it.
repeatedly in the Communist Manifesto that there has never been a system of production in the history of the world that was as effective at producing material commodities in excess than capitalism. Like that's extensively documented in the Communist Manifesto. And so if your proposition is, look, we got to get as much material security for everyone as possible, as fast as we can, and capitalism already seems to be doing that at a rate that's unparalleled in human history, wouldn't the logical thing be just to let the damn system play itself out? I mean, unless you're assuming that the evil capitalists are just going to take all of the flat screen televisions and put them in one big room and not let anyone else have one. The logical
that's definitely what Marxists think.
You're already on a road that's supposed to produce the proper material productivity. And so, well, that's 10 reasons, as far as I can tell. That
I mean, that is kind of a funny image. It's like a giant room, like Indiana Jones, with fucking televisions as far as the eye can see.
It could possibly be flawed, and also all in evidence that Marx was the kind of narcissistic thinker who could think. He was a very intelligent person, and so was Engels. But what he thought when he thought was that what he thought was correct, and he never went the second stage, which is, well, wait a second, how could all of this go terribly wrong? And if you're a thinker, especially a sociological thinker, especially a thinker on the broad scale, a social scientist, for example, one of your moral obligations is to think, you know, you might be wrong about one of your fundamental axioms, or 2 or 3 or 10. And as a consequence, you have the moral obligation to walk through the damn system and think, well, what if I'm completely wrong here and things invert and go exactly the wrong way? Like, I just can't understand how anybody could come up with an idea like the dictatorship of the proletariat, especially after advocating its implementation with violent means, which is a direct part of the Communist Manifesto, and actually think, if they were thinking, if they knew anything about human beings and the proclivity for malevolence that's part and parcel of the individual human being, that could do anything but lead to a special form of hell, which is precisely what did happen. And so I'm going to close, because I have 3 minutes, with a bit of evidence as well that Marx also thought that what would happen inevitably as a consequence of capitalism is the rich would get richer and the poor would get poorer. So there would be inequality. The first thing I'd like to say is we do not know how to set up a human system of economics without inequality. No one has ever managed it, including the communists. And the form of inequality changed, and it's not obvious by any stretch of imagination that the free market economies of the West have more inequality than the less free economies in the rest of the world. And the one thing you can say about capitalism is that although it produces inequality, which it absolutely does, it also produces wealth. And all the other systems don't. They just produce inequality. So here's a few stats. Here's a few free market stats, okay? From 1800 to 2017, income growth adjusted for inflation grew by 40 times for production workers and 16 times for unskilled labor. Well, GDP rose by a factor of about 0.5 from 180 to 1800. So from 180 to 1800 AD, it was like nothing, flat. And then all of a sudden, in the last 217 years, there's been this unbelievably upward movement of wealth. And it doesn't only characterize the tiny percentage of people at the top, who, admittedly, do have most of the wealth. The question is, not only, though, what's the inequality? The question is, well, what's happening to the absolutely poor at the bottom? And the answer to that is, they're getting richer faster now than they ever have in the history of the world. And we're eradicating poverty in countries that have adopted moderate free market policies at a rate that's unparalleled. So here's an example.
Or getting richer.
One of the UN millennial goals was to reduce the rate of absolute poverty in the world by 50% between 2000 and 2015. And they defined that as $1.90 a day. Pretty low, you know, but you have to start somewhere.
We hit that in 2012, 3 years ahead of schedule. And you might be cynical about that and say, well, it's kind of an arbitrary number, but the curves are exactly the same at $3.80 a day and $7.60 a day. Not as many people have hit that, but the rate of increase towards that is the same. The bloody UN thinks that we'll be out of poverty defined by $1.90 a day by the year 2030. It's unparalleled. And so the rich may be getting richer, but the poor are getting richer too. That's not the look. I'll leave it at that. Because I'm out of time. But I'll leave it with this. The poor are not getting poorer under capitalism. The poor are getting richer under capitalism by a large margin. And I'll leave you with one statistic, which is that now in Africa, the child mortality rate in Africa now is the same as the child mortality rate was in Europe in 1952. And so that's happened within the span of one lifetime. And so if you're for the poor, if you're actually concerned that the poorest people in the world rise above their starvation levels, then all the evidence suggests that the best way to do that is to implement something approximating a free market economy. And so thank you very much.
I just wanted to say, to jump in on that, that first off, I don't think that anything that Marx and Engels' writing precludes the fact that capitalism is a tremendously productive system. In fact, as he points out, it's very clearly stated in the Communist Manifesto. What's extremely problematic about his take is that
extensive prose poetry about how capitalism has developed productive forces to this point that he uses a biblical metaphor, and bourgeoisie has remade the world in its own image.
Right. I know, very abstract writing like that. But what's really problematic about this take is he doesn't acknowledge that a lot of the improvements in people's conditions came about through political agitation, reform, and revolution, and attributes all the benefits of rising lifestyle to capitalism, and none to the activism of the millions of people who actually struggled really, really hard in order to improve the lives of many of those who came after them. And there's just manifold examples of this. You can talk about the Reform Acts in the UK that allowed people to vote and also humanize labor conditions. When Marx and Engels were writing, the life expectancy of a laborer in one of the coal mines was 30 years. And that people as young as 8 years old could be employed. That was changed through political activism, not because the capitalist class decided that they were going to be more compassionate all of a sudden, but because workers banded together and said, we're not going to take this anymore. In Russia, for Christ's sake, which he should know since he's a fan of Dostoevsky, the serfs weren't emancipated till 1861, right? And this was something that people like Tolstoy, to come back to him, agitated really strongly and pronouncedly for, because they said, look, if we're not going to emancipate the serfs politically, this unequal system is going to persist, and the suffering associated with it is going to persist. And we could list examples of this on and on and on. But to say something as silly as, well, capitalism is the reason why we've seen improving life expectancies over the last 200 years, just demonstrates a staggering level of historical illiteracy and a real myopia when it comes to the complications in the world that he actually seems to be so invested in rhetorically.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that the language, the phrasing that if the rich are getting richer than the poor are getting, the notion to say the poor are getting richer, just that turn of phrase in and of itself is, I'm allergic to it. But, and again, it's funny because he throws out those statistics and makes that point right after he's said, like we're saying, like Marx and Engels, they say it right here that how productive capitalism is. And so, I think it's, you can acknowledge that more people have been lifted out of abject poverty due to the expansion of markets. I mean, it's also led to increased poverty in a number of other areas that have been entirely neoliberalized. I mean, at least keeping things to the past 40 years. But to say that means that the poor are getting richer, it's kind of a sleight of hand that is, yeah.
Yeah, I'll give you a really good example. Amartya Sen, who was a favorite of Michael Brooks, brought up. In 1843, in British India, Britain, a very capitalist country, the Great Bengal famine took place, and millions of people starved to death, even though there was more than enough food to feed everyone. Right? The economic system that was organized there, based on a system of brutal capitalist imperialist exploitation, just wasn't efficient enough to make sure that these people would get a decent caloric intake every day. And one of the things that Amartya Sen points out that changed conditions in a country like India and many other parts of the world wasn't actually the compassion of capitalists to try to actually improve food conditions for many people. It was the spread of democratization, because surprise, surprise, if you have a democratic government in power, they might have a little bit of an incentive to make sure that millions of people who might vote for them don't, starve. So this was actually a much bigger catalyst for ending things like world hunger than even the spread of just a specific economic mode of production. And again, there's other factors that we can talk about as well. Think about something like Norman Borlaug in the Green Revolution, where he spread all kinds of important agricultural technologies, patent-free, to developing countries to make sure that people wouldn't starve. And that's something that we could talk about. Borlaug's called the man who saved 1 billion lives. And there's just so many examples of this that we could list. Yeah, and I'll also say, so there are two things, one, that as capitalism spreads to pre-industrial regions, that people are lifted out of some of the most extreme forms of poverty is something that is like Marxism 101, of course, right? That's, it's, capitalism develops the productive forces, from where they are in pre-capitalist societies. And so, that does create more to go around. And so that does happen for sure. But also, the statistics that Peterson's citing are wildly misleading in a couple ways. So one, as he acknowledges, the standard is $2 a day. Even the World Bank says the more accurate measure is $5 a day, which, again, we're not talking about, $5 a day is not much to try to live on, but even if we're talking, the United States thinks it's radical to institute $15 an hour, for fuck's sake. Yeah, exactly. So, if you go with the more accurate $5 a day figure instead of the $2 or $1.90 a day figure, then actually a lot of the claims that Peterson is recycling here from people like Steven Pinker just aren't true anymore. So that's concretely, there was a segment in episode 45 of the Michael Brooks show. They did a segment called Pinker Caught Being a Stinker about poverty stats.
I remember that. Yeah.
And they go through a lot of this there. And so, that's an important distinction, and especially because the impression that Pinker likes to give, the impression that Peterson is trying to give here, is of a gradually rising tide, right? Well, today they'll get $2, tomorrow they'll get $4, day after that they'll get $6. And so, poverty, capitalism is gradually doing away with poverty. But of course, if you actually pay attention even to the numbers they give you, it shows no such thing. It shows that people, making less than, that $2 a day, get up there. But that doesn't mean that, then they're on their way to making a living wage. That's just a separate subject. And final point about this, I saw somebody mention this in the chat, and I'll also say right after this debate, I wrote an article about it that you can see there called "Marx Deserves Better Critics." Where was that written, Ben? That was in Quillette, which I actually talk about the decision to publish it there at the end of the book, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns: A Critique of the Contemporary Left, Zero Books, 2021. But as I mentioned in there, one reason that I was I had a couple reasons for sending the article there rather than to some lefty socialist magazine. I wanted to reach people who wouldn't be reached there. So I also wrote in a very careful way. And I was like making a super narrow claim, like just whatever you think about Marx, this is Peterson doesn't understand him, and Marx deserves better critics. But one of the reasons that I did it in Quillette was that I saw Peterson tweet out Quillette articles all the time, so I thought there was a good chance that he would read it, and I was hoping that he'd be very annoyed by it. So that there was a kind of petty, dishonorable reason that I had for sending it there. But also I should say, by the way, as a result of the fact that I did have this article in Quillette, there's one of the strangest things that's happened to me in 3 years of doing this kind of work happened as a result of that, which is that Francis Fukuyama, of all people, tweeted out my article. It's like, oh, this is a good point.
Really?
That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, he's on the Bernie bandwagon, apparently.
Yeah.
He's changed his mind. History has resumed.
yeah. History, as it turned out, was only resting.
History redux.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
But also, I would say, like, it does maybe show the difference between Peterson and somebody like Fukuyama. That, like, whatever Fukuyama thought or now thinks about Marxism, he actually does know something about it, which is an important distinction with Jordan Peterson. So yeah, that's in any case. But yeah, actually, in that appendix. Or bonus essay at the end of the book, I do, I talk about the debate a little bit more in general there. One of the things, and I don't want to delay this any later. It's 11:39. We clearly got to knock off for tonight. But one of the things maybe we can play at the beginning of part 2 of this next week that I point out at the end of the book is that before this happened, right? Before Peterson expressed an interest in debating Slavoj, he turned down an invitation to debate Richard Wolff, and his stated reason for turning down Richard Wolff was that Marxism is so discredited by the atrocities of Stalinism that it would be like debating a Nazi. And there's something really interesting there because, no shade on Slavoj Zizek, who's an extremely interested and insightful thinker who I've been reading and watching for many years, and I had a blast hanging out with this afternoon. But out of the two of them, Richard Wolff and Slavoj Zizek, there is one of these people who is comfortable expressing a bit more ambiguity about the history of actually existing socialism than the other one.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, I also think, like, if they wanted the debate to really be Marxism versus capitalism, then Richard Wolff would have been, Richard would have gladly, taken the Marxist position, which we'll see that. I mean, Slavoj has a very strange, very idiosyncratic way of doing it. Let's put it that way.
I also always like to say that if Peterson thinks that Nazism is so discredited, he should probably stop citing a Nazi like Heidegger positively on such a regular basis, right?
Well, I mean, that's the insane thing about it, right? So, like, Karl Marx, just to review some stuff I mentioned in that article, Karl Marx never advocated or supported any sort of one party or one person dictatorship, as we talked about earlier. His model was the Paris Commune, which was ultra democratic. He certainly never supported any dictatorship that existed during his lifetime. In fact, the only head of state who he thought highly enough of to so much as send him a friendly telegram in his entire life, as far as I know, was Abraham Lincoln. But in
they both shared a love of beards,
there's actually apparently, I think Lincoln for a long time was actually clean shaven, if I'm remembering this right. That there was there was somebody.
Yeah.
Holy hell, that changes everything for me.
Then he saw Marx because Marx was like, what are you doing? And then he grew the beard.
Yeah. Well, actually, it is funny to think about that that Lincoln almost certainly had read Marx even before that telegram, because he wouldn't have read like the Communist Manifesto or anything like that, but he would have read Marx in the New York Herald Tribune, because that was like the Tribune.
Yeah.
That was like the main like Republican Party aligned newspaper, and Marx wrote for it extensively, and it's also, but yeah, apparently, supposedly the thing that got Lincoln to grow a beard was that there was like some woman who wrote him a letter, saying that like all of the ladies would find him, like much more appealing if he if he would grow a beard. But in any case, yeah, like it's so Marx had a 10 for 10, 100% record of supporting democracy in his lifetime, but there were people who presided over undemocratic regimes who cited him as an inspiration, and that in Peterson's mind is enough to discredit him. But somehow he still likes Nietzsche, even though the Nazis like Nietzsche. Right. And not only does he like Nietzsche, who, I mean, to be fair, I think that Nietzsche can no more be blamed for Nazism than Marx can for Stalinism. But he also likes and approvingly cites Heidegger, who was literally a member of the Nazi Party.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I mean, if you're gonna chide someone for not being cautious about their rhetoric because they're not sure where it might lead, or if it might lead to disastrous conclusions, looking through some of Nietzsche's texts where he calls for wars without equal on the earth, you might think that there might be a few things to say about that. Right?
Yeah, there's that. All right, guys.
Hey, wait a minute. I just got a text from Feldman saying he's ready to do the midnight to 6 a.m. version of this.
We'll make it a full Bruce Springsteen concert.
He's ready to take over.
6 hours.
All right, awesome. So we'll turn we'll turn the stream over to Feldman, so we can all go to bed. He can I like maybe he can give his case for Jordan Peterson. I can say, look, I mean, I understand Slavoj Zizek's side of this argument. I'm an old lefty from way back. I get it. But no. So I would actually, I would love it if David would come on for something like this. I would actually. I'm going
to try to get Slavoj to go on David's show, because it wasn't the last time I was on, but I think he has a copy of the Žižek's jokes book. So I kind of want to get Slavoj to go on there, but.
Yeah, no, that'd be good. I can really vividly imagine what that would be like. But in any case, so we are, in fact, it has been over 3.5 hours, but it's good. I mean, we did the interview, of course, and we got through the part of the debate that's going to take longer than the next 2 hours, which is
sure.
Peterson's opening statement, because that actually has more misunderstandings per sentence than anything else I've ever seen. So I think just like the rest of the debate should go like nothing, by comparison to that opening statement. So we will be back next Sunday, same time, same channel, and we'll go through the remainder of the Žižek Peterson debate. Then should also say on Monday, tomorrow, I have not gotten a lot of sleep this weekend, it shows. Tomorrow, we have the first episode of Give Them an Argument season 2. The things we actually call episodes because we put them out on the podcast feed. So that is going to be David Griscom, who is going to be talking about Jean-Paul Sartre, his philosophy, his relationship to French communism. Since when I found out that Griscom was interested in that, I couldn't not have him on the show to talk about it. So that's going to be.
I'm going to watch that for sure.
Yeah. So So that's going to be tomorrow. Really looking forward to that. On Wednesday, we've got the first movie stream of season 2. We're going to be talking about Clockwork Orange.
Oh, that's cool.
And on Friday, I think for Philosophy Friday with Jennifer, we're going to be talking about Bertrand Russell's Philosophy of Language. Got part 2 of this next Sunday, and then a week from Monday for episode 2. It is going to be a banger for the first half. We're going to have Sam Cedar on to go over some of the highlights of his many debates with libertarians, since that's
I was just listening to I just put those on when I'm in a bad mood, and it does me a lot of good.
Nice. And then in the second half of the episode, we are going to have Toure Reed on. So that's I'm really looking forward to that. I really like that guy. So lots and lots of good stuff coming up in season 2. But meanwhile, if you were just here for the debate breakdowns, I will see you same time, same place next Sunday at 8. I may not have mentioned this, but I have a book out. It's called Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, a critique of the contemporary left. You can go buy it. That'd be all right. So anyway, I will. I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for doing this. See everybody next week. Left is best.
Peace, guys.